Hello, 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 hello. It's been a bit. Um, I've been doing a lot of grinding. Just give me 1 second. I want to set this all up. I want to watch some Hakeem videos today. So, I don't know where to start, to be honest with you. I might, no. So there's a lot. I'm just gonna go from the beginning, honestly. I'm just gonna, hmm.
Your friends are helping you renovate. You know you owe them dinner, right?
Delicious Schwann's home deliveries in the freezer.
That freezer?
And let me set up this bonfire.
Go from freezer to oven.
Imagine if you bought a new car and the tires that came with it couldn't be replaced. If anything happens to them, tough luck. Go pay 80% the price of a new car to get them fixed at an authorized repair shop. You wouldn't ever put up with this with cars, so why do you do so with phones and their batteries? Have you ever noticed that most printers you buy are both dirt cheap and absolute garbage, but the ink is ridiculously expensive? Well, that's an intentional strategy. Hook you in with a cheap printer only for you to be tied to insane cartridge prices, with the printer giving you intentionally wrong readings on your ink levels, forcing you to go out and get more when you don't really need more. Don't even think about refilling or, God forbid, third-party cartridges. It's such a wasteful strategy that some people simply buy a whole other printer instead because it could turn out to be cheaper. Why is it this way? Let me illustrate with a telling example. In the 1920s, the Phoebus Cartel, a collection of all major light bulb producers, got together to agree on reducing the effective lifetime of their light bulbs to 1,000 hours, down from 2,500 hours that was standard at the time, while increasing the price without fear of competition. This is an effective reduction of more than half, and they got away with it too. Nylon, which could pull trucks out of ditches for military purposes, was intentionally structurally weakened in manufacture of clothing so that you buy more once said clothing inevitably rips. This leads to the question, why does it seem like things break more often now? We've all had or seen old appliances, electronics, or otherwise that have lasted
really
many
fast.
years, in some instances even decades. So what
That's
changed?
cool.
Planned obsolescence, a policy of producing
Planned
consumer goods that rapidly
obsolescence.
become obsolete and so require replacing, achieved by frequent change in design, termination
Hey,
of
how
the
you
supply of
doing,
spare
buddy?
parts, and the use of non-durable materials. We've all heard of the concept before, it's tired at this point. Intentionally making things that break more
Yeah,
often,
I've been
artificially
working.
slowing them down, or reducing.
I've been working a lot, doing between 6 to 2s in the morning, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m.s and 2 p.m. to 10 p.m.s. Um, my schedule right now is so off, and it kind of sucks because I really want to have like a consistent stream schedule, and I'm just popping in every now and then, being like, hey, here I am, you know. How you doing? No. Just do that.
Their usability through software updates, or vicious marketing aimed at psychologically engineering an unfashionable image around a still working product. As a result, this reduces the time in between repeat purchases of said product, generating a larger volume of sales in the long term. This is referred to as shortening the replacement cycle in business speak. What this means for you, in concrete terms, is stuff breaks down or becomes less and less usable, forcing you to spend more money and increase waste. To quote Vance Packard, the famous critic of consumerism, in essence, it is the systematic attempt of business to make us wasteful, debt-ridden, permanently discontented individuals. How exactly is this done, though? Let's name a few strategies. Repair locking, an Apple favorite, of course. Many electronic devices and components could easily be repaired, but it is now becoming company policy to make that impossible, either through making replacement parts unavailable, making them overly expensive and only open to purchase for authorized stores, or through warranty voiding agreements. Pentalobe screws, 5-pointed flower-shaped screws that are incompatible with regular screwdrivers, are placed to prevent easy removal with tools you might already have around the house. Likewise, irreplaceable batteries with a short lifetime are common practice. Sometimes they're even glued in. This leaves you with no other choice than to buy a new device, even if the old one was perfectly fine for your purposes. Otherwise, you can go to an authorized repair shop and pay up to 70 or 80% of their original price of the phone, again simply pushing you to buy a new one instead. Software limitation and manipulation. another Apple favorite, but of course not restricted to them by any means. Examples include new sets of updates being rolled out only for them to be denied to your 3-year-old phone for no reason other than encouraging you to buy the next model up. Meanwhile, prior to new releases, old devices are intentionally slowed down or otherwise limited to encourage new sales.
Yep.
Batteries are repair locked and intentionally built to significantly degrade after a product cycle, say for example 2 years. Again, so you get another phone entirely rather than the sensible thing of simply replacing the battery. In my own field, medicine, planned obsolescence is rampant, with many things produced for single use with the intention of discarding them and purchasing more, rather than reprocessing them for several rounds of use, which is a possibility. The most typical example is through downgrading materials to ensure that after very little use, the device falls apart. Hospitals have seen manufacturers downgrading material to the point where device obsolescence may actually happen during the first use, rather than after the case. Contrived durability. An extension of the above, it's when there is a conscious strategy before manufacture of shortening the lifetime of a product by reducing the lifetime, usually the durability, of its subcomponents. As a result, the product deteriorates far more quickly due to fragile or lower quality parts and hence encourages more replacement purchases. This is especially insidious as it is difficult to detect and be able to follow through on legally, hence making legislation against it basically impossible. Programmed obsolescence. The easiest to detect of the bunch and fairly common with, for example, printers. Inkjet printer manufacturers place chips in their ink cartridges to prevent them from being used after a certain number of pages are printed or a certain amount of time has passed, even though the cartridge itself has up to 50% usable ink left. Canon was even sued over a printer/scanner model that disabled the scanning function till new ink cartridges were installed. Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Atlas VPN. For a lot of research that I do for my videos, I end up hitting pages that aren't available in my location. That's frustrating, as you can imagine. Geo-restriction really does suck, but not with Atlas VPN. For those unaware, a virtual private network makes all of your internet traffic travel through an encrypted tunnel. This way, it protects you from spying, public Wi-Fi dangers, and hides your IP address and your online activities. It even allows you to change your location for all your researching needs. Developed by top cybersecurity specialists and IT engineers in 2019, Atlas VPN was created to make the internet accessible and secure for everybody. Currently, it has more than 6 million users worldwide, and boasts the best VPN deal on the market, with the most affordable online protection plan for just under $2 per month.
I'm trying to get my
with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So, what are you waiting for? Go down to the description and click that link, or use my code Hakeem and get a 3-year subscription for just $1.99 a month. But that's not all. You get blazing fast speeds for streaming or gaming, unlimited protection for all your devices, and an inbuilt ad and malware blocker. And let's not forget, you'll also get to save some extra cash, as Atlas VPN will find you the best deals online for everything from your online subscriptions to airlines, hotels, and more. Right now, Atlas VPN is running a huge discount, meaning you can get a 3-year subscription for just $1.99 a month with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Time is running out, so get your deal by clicking the link in the video description below. Massive thanks to Atlas VPN for the sponsorship. This is what allows me to pay my editor fairly, so the support is highly appreciated. Alright, back to the video. Perceived obsolescence, on the other hand, is another monstrosity of capitalism in which things that are perfectly fine and usable are deemed quote-unquote out of fashion through manipulative advertising intended on driving consumption. Nowhere is this more common than in the fashion industry, which has constant reboots of seasonal collections with little to no real variation so that you keep buying. Constant aesthetic switching, in which one style goes out for a new one to come in only for the original to come back again, is dogma in the fashion industry. This of course doesn't skip playing on every real or advertising driven manufactured insecurity in people so that they again consume. To quote Brooks Stevens, the one who popularized the term, planned obsolescence is instilling in the buyer the desire to own something a little newer, a little better, a little sooner than is necessary. All these lead to ridiculous overburdening of recycling capabilities if they even exist in the first place, and in turn mostly ends up as environmental waste, and that's not even mentioning the environmental damage from the production process in the first place. The average lifespan of a smartphone in the US is less than 2 years, and in 2010 alone, 141 million smartphones were discarded, with 89% ending up in landfills. This sort of overproduction and waste further fans imperialist domination and conflicts within the regions where the materials necessary are extracted, like with cobalt in the Congo. Prior to this riveting development of capitalism becoming ubiquitous, things actually kind of lasted, so long as you maintain them semi-reasonably. An anecdotal example from my life, my father bought a Parlux hairdryer in the late 1990s that I have used until 2 years ago, when it fell and I cracked the plastic handle. Had I chosen to repair it, I would still be using it for probably many years to come. Think about that though. 20 plus years for a hairdryer that costs pretty much nothing in the grand scheme of things. The oven and stove I used in university was over 25 years old, and likewise with the microwave. Check your grandma's house if you doubt me.
Okay, you know what?
Alright, this is all well and good, but why is this so?
I can actually deposit these?
Simply,
Why would I be able
capitalism.
to deposit those?
The logic of the system dictates that profits should be above all. How do you best maximize profits? By sticking to strict environmental regulation, antitrust and anti-monopoly laws perhaps? Maintaining ethical business practices if such a thing even exists? No, of course not. You need to beat the other guy in the market. What this means is buy out or sabotage the competition so that you win. This means use your political contacts to lobby for loopholes for you, whether it be taxes or environmental legislation. Offshore labor and pay them pennies on the dollar. Employ a massive network of sinister advertising so that you use and abuse every single option at your disposal so that you sell and sell more. Of course, planned obsolescence sits comfortably in this scheme. It's simply the logic, or rather lack of logic, of the system. Furthermore, planned obsolescence feeds the constant cycling of money and capital of the system, which is one of the ways capitalist economic policy tries to, but completely fails at, avoiding recessions. Overproduction without consumption causes a crisis in the market. So spend. Aside from low interest rates and other incentives, let's also manipulate the production process itself so that we increase waste and waste more people's time for a nonsensical socioeconomic system not compatible with the planet we live on. This was official post-Great Depression policy too, by the way. So what do we do? What's the solution? Reformism isn't the key. One solution by the Environmental Law Institute is to create legal penalties, for example lawsuits for breaking perceived anti-obsolescence laws. But this is a solution that hasn't worked for tax dodging, emission report data fudging, or pretty much any other field. If they can't simply lobby to get the law cancelled, then they'll play expensive legal games wasting tax money before at best paying a moderate fine, or at worst nothing coming of it. Afterwards, they simply diversify their production process so that you can't really catch them to the letter of the law. And finally, they have holdings, manufacture, etc., all in countries with no anti-obsolescence laws, so you couldn't prosecute them even if you really wanted to. It's a game made by and for capitalists. You won't beat them at it. Short-term solutions, like repairing items yourself or properly maintaining them, is a decent personal step, but it won't help climate change nor change the current structures that be. Right to repair legislation, motions to prevent active attempts at planning such obsolescence, they're all good, but can be taken away at a moment's notice, as with every other concession from the ruling class under capitalism. Socialism is the only real solution. Of course, in a systemic sense, but let's take an example to drive the point home. In 1970s East Germany, a university research lab managed to develop a new form of strengthened glass. They took the idea to the relevant authorities, were given a patent for the invention, and immediately received state support for developing this into a standard. This standard would be termed Superfest, a form of glass chemically strengthened to the point of it basically being indestructible with normal day use. They aimed for it to be 5 times as durable, but ended up making it 15 times as durable as regular glass, all with increased heat resistance, lower weight, and increased stackability. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and merging of the two Germanys, the West German government immediately shut down all plants and ceased production of the glass, with a West German businessman stating, "Why should we take a glass that doesn't break? We make money with our glasses. Who saws off the branch on which they are sitting?" Capitalist thought process in action. For more on why capitalism is a failing system and why socialism is the answer, check out these 2 videos. If you're interested in learning more about planned obsolescence, I suggest you check out Made to Break by Giles Slade for a good, albeit liberal perspective. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons.
This is an opinion you can trust. From Rhonda Schwartz.
There we go. Let's go.
You know why we're very expensive? Because someone like you is greatly skeptical and think it.
My fellow Americans, it is with great sadness that I must report that BOFA has collapsed. Many have asked me, what's BOFA? To which I respond, BOFA these towers. I can say with full conviction that these attacks were not bussing for real.
Jesus.
We will find the people responsible for this evil act and bring them to justice, no cap.
So let's start with the first episode, which I had the displeasure of having to listen through. The guest of the first episode is CIA Director Bill Burns. Literally sounds like a fake name, like John Smith.
I wish he would do what his last name says.
Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. What? So in this episode, about many questions, the first one was asked, why did we start this podcast? To destroy some of the misconceptions people have about the Central Intelligentsia Agency. So, what are these misconceptions about the CIA, you might ask, that we will address? Like, do you use heroin and coke to fund right-wing terror groups? How many countries did you help overthrow? Why were you behind some of the most batshit insane torture programs against foreign as well as domestic citizens? And many, many more. No, the biggest misconception is that people think we're like James Bond, and then Bill goes in to say, it's not as glamorous as the films make it out to be. He reminds us he drives.
There are no one-liners when we kill minorities.
He drives. Listen to this. He drives a 2013 Subaru and can never get his remote to work. He hates speeding.
Good for you, man.
And is constantly
King.
cold
Stan.
boring by his daughters. Guys, look at me. I'm so relatable to most podcast listeners. Aren't I? I'm also lazy like you, motherfucker.
Bill, your daughters are gonna hate you when they grow up and learn a little bit about the world. You will be remembered as a criminal.
Jesus.
But we are blessed then by brilliant
okay, so
points that
they're gonna
answer
just.
the
This is just
previous,
highlights from a couple
question
episodes
about why
of this.
the words
Oh my
education
god.
and ingenuity speak to who we
They're,
are as an agency. He says, and all of these.
I
again,
haven't
quote,
watched in a bit.
There is
so
a great sense of mission. The risks of our officers and their families make our motivations very easy. I am reminded of this every time I pass our memorial wall, which is honoring all the 139 fallen colleagues we've lost.
Rip Bozo.
I mean, I never like downplaying death, even if it's one of these guys, but 139.
I don't mind.
Like,
fuck them. Fuck
I-
all
I
of
know,
them.
but-
I hope they're. Sorry.
But I agree completely. But they are either totally lying or their job is not as dangerous as it sounds. I mean, isn't the difficulty of doing your duty for your country such a big thing over there? Because we're supposed to be thankful to these people who risk their lives in the line of duty. So I went ahead and did some math. The CIA has existed for 75 years, right? Well, 139, which is the number of CIA agents that died in the line of duty, divided by 75 is 1.85. Let's say, okay, let's round it up at 2 people die per year in the line of duty for the CIA. And this is supposed to be a dangerous fucking job. 56 lodging workers die a year. 70 aircraft and flight engineers die a year. 96 roofers die a year. 37 garbage collectors die a year. 966 delivery drivers die a year. 257 farmers die a year. Where is their plaque, motherfucker? Like, thank your pizza delivery boy for his service next time.
The thin crust line. The thin crust line flag.
None of this is anything as compared to the biggest golden moment of this episode. Once he goes through all the reasons why dedication and ingenuity are so important for the agency, he goes, and I quote, I would add, I swear I didn't invent this like I wish I did. I would add to dedication and ingenuity one more statement, and that is that we are apolitical.
What?
Fucking suck my dick.
He
Suck
said,
my fuck you.
I did not invent
Fuck.
this. I wish I
That's the
came
most
up with
absurd
this.
thing I've ever heard.
And then he continues. Let me
actually-
just
hold
quote, and
on,
then
hold
you.
on.
Then
Oh,
you
man.
We do not prefer political policies or agendas. We just want to deliver the best intelligence and analysis as we can. We give policymakers information that they need to hear, not what they want to hear. Fucking incredible.
Wow,
bro.
the selfless fucking crusaders for I was gonna say for violence. That was a
Yeah,
Freudian
that's
slip
true.
for freedom. Yeah.
Tracking and reconciling business expenses across multiple systems can be disjointed. But with travel banks end-to-end
this is to me the biggest mask off moment, even bigger than what the Hakim mentioned with the apolitical comment. Also, it's important we work closely with the private sector so that our companies can compete better with those of foreign countries.
I see.
Basically, admitting companies can use the CIA to
Okay.
outplay foreign companies. Only something communists have been saying about bourgeois competition leading to international war since, I don't know, fucking 2 centuries ago. Literally coming out of his mouth on an
Guys.
18-minute fucking podcast
Guys.
episode. It's fucking art.
True.
Like,
Please.
Very true.
You seem to forget that the market finds a solution. In this case, it's employing literal
It's a
death
cancer
squad
gun.
agents, so that the fucking toothpaste that's produced in Zimbabwe is
Oh
fucking.
my god.
Oh my god! Kill the PR officials.
I'm imagining the CIA agent dropping in and like garroting a floss producer with his own floss.
Something that immediately stood out is this liberal production quality NPR cringe, right? There's a soft-speaking white guy, and there's this shitty music that's very cinematic for some reason in the background. The vibes are off. That's what I said. The vibes were not, right? Very boring, very, I could see people actually falling asleep to it, unironically.
Yeah.
The advice
That's how
I
they
would give is,
brainwash you. That's the idea. Then they implant their join the CIA. Join the CIA when you're asleep.
Exactly. We don't give pensions, but join the CIA.
That's why I was
what gonna
craving
say.
joining the CIA so much. Oh my god. Oh shit, did I out myself
yeah.
now?
So they begin the episode by praising William J. Donovan, who was the founder of the CIA, or the founding father of the CIA. He founded the OSS and other bullshit. But basically the precursor to the CIA, and he was instrumental in the formation of the CIA. And he has arguably the most propaganda polished, positive Wikipedia page I've ever seen. More than American presidents, more than... There is not a single negative word about this guy in, a huge Wikipedia article, which is, telling in and of itself.
Yeah.
Especially when they hide very, buried within the article, they hide the fact that this guy took a look at the Gestapo and was like, I want to make that, but for the U.S. This is actually... He was like, I want to make an American Gestapo. And the CIA idea was based on, basically, an American Gestapo. Which, if that's all you need, that is basically all you need to know, really. Yeah. Anyway, so this douche basically traveled all around the world, befriending every fascist dictator, helping them set up death squads to fight communism, all that nonsense. And then he became demented into his old age because, he's hated by everything divine. And I quote, he imagined he was in a hospital, by the way. He's demented, he's about to fucking go out, right? The lights are gonna go out, and then he's gonna wake up next to Satan fucking being sodomized, right? Anyways, and I quote, he imagined he saw the Red Army coming over the 59th Street Bridge into Manhattan, and in one memorable last mission fled the hospital, wandering down the street in his pajamas. The fucking dweeb. I like how they try to make this heroic. My guy, you would have been mushed under some fucking T-57 or something, and you would deserve it. But anyways, yeah, just imagine this old fucking demented white guy from the fucking the Reds are coming with his fucking balls hanging out of his boxers. Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Atlas VPN. For a lot of research that I do for my videos, I end up hitting pages that aren't available in my location. That's frustrating, as you can imagine. Geo-restriction really does suck. There's this one woman, one of the Karens, and she's speaking, and she's like, we used to say that the CIA is pale, male, and Yale, but now we emphasize diversity and inclusivity. And even then, yeah, by the way, fucking, Snake in Metal Gear 1 when he's being tortured, and he's like, that's basically what I fucking felt. Basically, it's the most fucking I remember I physically paused, and I was like, fuck. and the reason I hate it as well is because they specifically emphasize that diversity and inclusivity is necessary for them to continue to do their job. So it's not even for diversity and inclusivity's sake. It's because now whenever they try to infiltrate somewhere, like a fucking if they, yeah, exactly. That's what they say. It's like we need some fucking blacks to get.
We used to have whites all over Africa, so it was relatively fucking easy. But we failed our job, so now there's not as fucking many.
Oh my god!
And now the Chinese are like
we've got a few openings in China. We need one of those Asian-looking fellas. So, in summary, a message to the host of this show: fuck you, Walter. Fuck you, D. Fuck you,
Nuts.
Yes.
These nuts.
Yeah, D's nuts.
Yeah.
You will all be remembered as monsters and criminals. Your children and grandchildren will be ashamed of you. You've blackened a branch of your family tree, and you will be hated until you are finally forgotten. The CIA deserves to be destroyed. That's all. That's the summary of my episode.
Get fucked.
Gopnik's tickled.
Oh my god, I'm hard, baby. Woo!
Sorry. So JT, what was that you were saying? What would happen to me if you didn't bleep me?
Our sweet Ugopnik here was complaining that I put the cricket sound effect in the last episode after he asked very kindly for FBI sound effects, and he was complaining that I never do the same to Hakeem. To which I responded that our boy Hakeem will be drone striked if I do not bleep the things he says. So please understand that I just don't want you guys to die. But Ugopnik, there's some unrest where you are too, right? Are you gonna get drone striked soon?
Soon Hakeem will not be the only person in this podcast that will use the I can get the drone strike card, I guess. Because there's some conflict brewing in my little corner of the world as well. Now, hopefully it's not going to lead to anything, and it's just idiot banana republics flexing at each other with very, very pathetic and usual rhetoric. But in case something does happen, I will have to buy like a very good sound isolating microphone, because it would probably have to record while in the trenches, and I'm like, so yeah, what about Nancy Pelosi?
But there you go. Now you know. When you get summoned for jury duty, go. Don't get arrested, but don't expect it to be super exciting.
A question: if you shat yourself in the thing, would that be an excuse for you to go?
I imagine
Yeah,
I'd imagine they'd want you out of the courtroom, but I don't know.
I'm just saying, if what's it called? Push comes to shove, and you really need to get out of it, and you don't have an excuse just to shit yourself.
I mean, that's a major roll of the dice, though. Like, what if they don't excuse you?
You just have to sit there.
Hi, I'm Marcus Trufant, former Seattle Seahawk. You probably don't think about it much, but thousands get hurt.
For Evie and Kelsey both had an infection shortly after Evie was born that they had to get treated for. So I think Evie was there for like 2 days and Kelsey was there overnight. And then one dog also ended up in the dog hospital for eating swallowing a bird whole. So that was
wow.
Wait, excuse me, what?
Yeah, he found a bird.
No.
And he swallowed it whole somehow, and it did a number on his insides.
Was it the bird male? Because that would mean he swallowed a cock.
Oh my god! God damn you!
Just like he's good at swallowing it whole, just like his owner.
Oh my god! I like the hesitation when you're saying that. I was gonna say, hold on, JT. Aren't dogs made for eating?
Right?
Like what?
They're made for chewing them slightly, though. That's the thing. He scarfed it down. There was a whole canary or something in his stomach. They had to, cut him open and
Yeah, he's
poor
used
guy.
to from
Very
watching his
Looney
owner,
Tunes.
take them all immediately, not even prepare them properly.
Good one, dude. Good one.
And he says you never get triggered. I found your soft spot, baby. And it's literally your gag reflex.
Yeah, I have a
50
wild.
wood
I
cutting.
can't go
I'm a
to the
horrible
doctor
coder.
and
50 wood cutting
I had to get
Let's see.
a strep throat swab because I was my throat was really bothering me.
Nothing.
And they the
all
second
had
that
to-
thing touches my tongue or goes past my teeth, I start gagging. I have
so
a
much
terrible
stuff I
gag
gotta
reflex.
do.
It's awful.
We would make horrible boyfriends, really,
We
really
would.
shitty boyfriends.
Honestly, I would disappoint
I'm
people
the deep
so
throat
bad.
king, baby. You can't. No. I'm all right with it, but try tucking your thumbs next time.
Tucking my thumbs?
Yeah, take your thumbs and tuck them into your palm, and then close your thumbs over your palm.
Really?
What?
Okay.
Yeah, it works.
That's some
Okay.
experience.
Try it next
Fucking
time.
glug
Works.
glug 7,000 Hakeem 5 million.
I finally got my Volvo wagon project in the works.
Alhamdulillah.
It's
do
going
this.
in next.
I'm just gonna go to
Hello.
the next one.
Almost every time socialism is discussed, some flaw, which in my experience is usually a misconception, if not outright projection, will be brought up that something makes socialism unworkable. I'm here to clear up these misconceptions. One of the most common things that we hear is that supposedly there is no capacity for innovation under socialism. In order to clear up this misconception, we need to explain how many of the innovations we use today came about. Your blank was made by capitalism is a strange phrase that doesn't make much sense under further scrutiny. First of all, capitalism, socialism, or any other isms don't make anything. Workers make everything. Isms just determine who gets paid in the end. Those isms basically reflect how working people relate to means of production, and how they are remunerated for their work. I made a deeper dive 101 video that explains all this here. Under capitalism, the driving force for investment in the development of technology is profit. If it's profitable, capitalists will fund it. If it's not profitable, even if it were to save millions of lives or the climate, an ever-pressing issue, it wouldn't get funded. If it won't make some shareholders somewhere richer, forget about it. Under socialism, on the other hand, the driving factors for development of new technologies, techniques, medicines, or whatever else are human need and human creativity, rather than profits. Of course, some sort of social surplus has to be accounted for, but that can be accommodated without profit seeking. I cover this more clearly in this video here, but
You said close your eyes, don't look down.
I'm keeping things simple for now. Let's just think for a second though. Let me ask you this, how many Newtons, Ghazalis, and Einsteins has humanity lost in sweatshops, on cotton fields, or in cobalt mines? How many due to systemic imperialism draining the third world of resources and keeping them poor? How much human potential was locked behind United Fruit Company plantations and Sri Lankan tea farm? Under capitalism, higher education, a necessary prerequisite to innovation and development, is locked behind very, very expensive tuition fees and other expenses of universities. That is, if people are even literate in the first place and have completed lower forms of education. Currently, hundreds of millions are illiterate, and many on top of that, even in supposedly highly developed countries, are functionally illiterate and are unable to contribute to their communities as a result. 30% of the world's population haven't even completed lower secondary school education, a level that has been stagnant since the early 2000s. Even in countries with free education, old systemic inequalities still play negative roles, albeit to a lower extent than, for example, in the US. Under socialism, all stages of education, from pre-K to postgraduate education, are absolutely free. That's why even some of the poorest countries on Earth reach literacy and university completion levels similar to those of far wealthier capitalist countries. And for a deeper dive, I suggest you check out these videos here. Currently, only 6.5% of the world's adult population has a college degree, and the majority of them only do because they are financially capable of acquiring one or lived in a country where universities were actually available and free to access. This means that up to 94% of human intellectual, scientific, and innovative capacity is being left unharvested by a global capitalist system that only grants higher educational development to an elite few. Capitalism, in reality, actually stifles useful innovation. US pharmaceutical companies do virtually no research aimed at developing new drugs to cure diseases such as tuberculosis and malaria, for the most part, which kill tens of millions of low-income people every single year in the third world. They instead fund research on new remedies for acne or toenail fungus, which can be sold to high-income consumers in wealthier markets. Even when massive outbreaks occur, unless there is massive financial incentive along with state and tax subsidies, nothing happens. That's not even commenting on parallel development by two firms of the same or similar technology, wasting twice as many resources so that one reaches the market as quickly as possible, even through dubious means if necessary. Whatever innovation is done, it's used for profit rather than for human need. As an example, Pfizer's patented drug fluconazole, which cures cryptococcal meningitis, a deadly side effect of AIDS, sells for $18 a pill, placing it beyond the reach of AIDS sufferers in southern Africa, for example. A generic version, produced in Thailand, however, outside the reach of Pfizer's patent, costs 60 cents a pill. The patent has expired since, and generics have become more frequent as a result, but I already hear someone saying, if they didn't patent it and charge a premium, regardless of the ethics, it would deter research in the future as they wouldn't be able to secure a return on investment. That would be a sound argument if these major pharmaceutical companies didn't receive massive tax breaks and government funding for much of what they develop. That's not even mentioning how many taxes they dodge. COVID vaccines were a perfect, but far from the only, example. For a further dive into how you basically have already paid twice for everything through state funding, take a look at this video here. Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Guardio. Guardio is a browser extension which helps you protect yourself as you browse online on all your devices. Plenty of people save sensitive data directly on their browsers, including a link in the description to start your 7-day free trial, as well as get 20% off Guardio Premium. No charge during the free trial, plan for full protection. Big thanks to Guardia for the sponsorship. This is what allows me to pay my editor fairly, so the support is very appreciated. Alright, back to the video. Let's entertain the idea though. If something truly was made by capitalism, then surely must have been funded by capitalists and been from the private sector, right? Surprisingly, the majority, I dare say even all of the things we've become so close with, came out of government-funded public sector projects, not the private sector. Funding came from either the public, from civilian government institutions, or from the military. To give examples of things that came out of government funding overall, touchscreens were developed by government enterprises in Britain and by CERN. GPS and the Soviet equivalent GLONASS were developed by the militaries of the US and the USSR respectively. Microchips were also a government project. Image sensors, accelerometers, satellites, the internet, barcodes, radar, vaccines, green energy sources, even all the background work for Google was done through government funding. Mariana Mazzucato from the University of Sussex states that every major technological change in recent years traces most of its funding back to the state. Even early-stage private sector venture capitalists come in much, much later, after the big breakthroughs have been made.
Let's go.
Adding on to this, a recent article from the Scientific American stated that without government support, most basic scientific research will never happen. It's evidently clear that it isn't capitalism we can thank for these innovations, it is public funding, the type that is massively bolstered and supported under socialism. In fact, innovation has happened not due to capitalism necessarily, and in many instances has happened in spite of it. Short of the early history of capitalism, in which relentless expansion of the productive forces and their efficiency, including the overworking of men, women, and children, forced a cynical development of technology. Now, instead, we get nonsense like the Juicero, or yet another gig economy app for people to slave away at for less than minimum wage. To consider capitalism as the source of humanity's recent great achievements is silly to say the least. Intelligent people, working very hard, with a state behind them that provides them with the funds, equipment, education, and facilities they need are what we should thank. Under socialism, massive public projects for this sort of great innovation aren't only possible, it's already happened before. For science, socialism is what will lead the road ahead. On an interesting side note though, a lot of innovation did happen under socialism, contrary to the usual nonsense you hear. Satellites, LEDs, the first nuclear power plant in Obninsk, some of the first antibiotics, interlaced video, methods for preventing the transfer of HIV from mother to child, cadaveric blood transfusion, laser eye surgery, the electric rocket motor used for spacecraft to this day, space stations, lung cancer vaccines, even the first mobile phone, and much more were all invented or done in socialist countries. Imagine a world where innovation is the enjoyment of all of humanity rather than a select few in half a dozen countries. Imagine a world where education is treated like the human right it intrinsically is, and where everyone has access to free, high-quality education at all levels. Imagine a world where your community's needs and your personal creativity are what drive innovations and not the need to turn a profit for some middle management asshat named Kyle. Imagine a world where we have true democracy, economic democracy. Imagine socialism. That conveniently for us has already been tried and tested. If you're of the thinking that socialism failed as a response to my little comment, we'll take a look at this video here. That's all well and good though, but things can be even better. Not only can the full potential of human ingenuity be unlocked through widespread educational policies, but also I'm sure you've heard of automation. Far from being a vision of some sci-fi future, it's actually a meaningful possibility within our lifetimes. Within the next few decades, humanity will see robots and machines slowly become a larger and larger part of production, cutting working hours and prices down and increasing productivity. That's all good, no? So why is it such a controversial topic? First of all, what is automation? In the most basic definition, it's the introduction of a machine that will do labor that previously required a human being. All the complex drilling, lifting, cutting, manipulating, putting together, and much more that used to take anywhere from 1 worker to 100 workers now requires just a set of machines finely tuned doing what needs to be done perfectly. The hurdle, though, as is commonplace nowadays, is capitalism. Let me explain. A capitalist will automate a factory, and through doing this he will see productivity rise and his long-term costs go down, as he will fire the workers now made redundant due to the introduction of these new machines. These workers that have now become a liability for the capitalist are let go, as the capitalist has no need to pay wages, provide paid maternity leave, vacation time, sick days, etc., since robots don't get pregnant or need vacations. The sheer amount of jobs that will be lost due to automation is staggering. Truck drivers, who occupy millions of jobs in the United States alone, will all lose their employment due to the advent of self-driving cars. Cashiers, clerks, receptionists, and anyone working behind a stand or counter of any sort will lose their jobs to computers. Even more highly intricate or technically involved jobs can face certain threats from this development. This eventually spells a problem for capitalism, that the capitalists don't foresee. They're known for their lack of foresight, after all. That's actually incorrect. They do foresee it, they just don't care. These capitalists that now produce much more for much less because of automation won't actually be able to sell their products. All these out-of-job workers won't have the money to buy any of these products that capitalists are churning out, and voila, one of the many contradictions of capitalism unfolds. Some may say that a universal basic income is the solution to this crisis, but I've already made a video regarding this point that you can view here. Regardless, think about that for a second. Automation, such a beautiful, amazing thing, is rendered not only frightening but downright destructive because of the inherent nature of capitalism. That's not even mentioning the misanthropic sense of the system, which would sooner keep you working 8, 10, or 12 hours, increasing your working day if they can get away with it, even with skyrocketing productivity as a result of further automation and improvements in production, just as the real wage versus productivity curve since the 70s, by the way. But what if there was an alternative? Rather than having machines put large swaths of the population out of work due to the anarchy of capitalism in the market, under socialism these machines would be used as intended, to reduce the amount of work we all need to do without dropping people from the workforce, as a planned restructuring of production can take place, opening up new avenues for employing those whose work has become automated. Rather than working 8, 10, 12-hour days, people can work 2, 3, or 4-hour days and have automation pick up the productivity slack. Lower running costs long term, and better humane outcomes for those that make up any socioeconomic system to begin with. Under socialism, regular working people like you and I will control the implementation of automation, unlike under capitalism, where capital does. Automation will be made to serve the interests of humanity rather than profit. Eventually, with automation becoming near universal, human beings would be freed from work in its more convenient and tedious forms. A possible future is that instead of being an appendage of the machine, human beings would now have the work of designing and maintaining machines instead, a form of work that is much more versatile and requires education and creativity, along with other administrative and technical work. On top of this, human beings will be able to devote time to their own creative development, allowing for everyone to maximize their creative potential for creation of art or invention or entertainment. The key to our own liberation lays in our hands, but the Bezoses and Pelosi's of the world wouldn't like you knowing that. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Ned Wanda, Mike, Peter Lewis, Emil Vakitov, Isaac Anke, Savo, Felix Paulson, Amin Nishad, Abdurrahman, and Ahmed Berge.
This is an opinion you can trust. From Rhonda Schwab, the owner of a BBB-accredited kayak repair shop. Rhonda connected with Better Business Bureau.
Stryker Home Care. Provide confident care for your loved one.
Hello. What if I told you you've already paid twice for nearly every single private service and commodity? It's true. You pay through your taxes going to subsidies and public government development for nearly everything in modern civilized existence, as well as paying the bills that private companies who have monopolized those services send you. This video is going to focus primarily on the largest capitalist economy, the US, but is more or less applicable to most of the world. We live under a class dictatorship of a particular ruling class. Those with the most money, property, and capital control practically every facet of our lives. It naturally follows that, looking out for their interests, they take part in a grotesque form of corporate welfare, in which they, through their government representatives and assets, take out huge sums in the forms of tax breaks, price supports, loan guarantees, bailouts, payments in kind, subsidized insurance rates, marketing services, export subsidies, irrigation and reclamation programs, and research and development grants. Don't believe me? Well, let's take a look at the facts. In the mid-2000s, government payouts to massive corporations totaled nearly $100 billion, almost 3 times the amount spent on social welfare programs like food stamps in that single year. Just to remind you, 41 million Americans rely on food stamps, just for a little perspective. This nearly $100 billion doesn't include all other forms of government aid to corporations either. For example, the US government sells off or leases billions of dollars of public natural resources, think oil, coal, minerals, etc., off to corporations far below market value, and has outdated royalty collection laws from the 1920s that have resulted in billions in profits for the companies exploiting those resources, and that is if the government even remembers to collect on those royalties in the first place. Even in times of crisis, insane sums of money are lent as assistance to the largest entities and banks at below market interest rates by design. A corporation overcharges the government? No problem, maybe a slap on the wrist. Defense contractors need a little extra.
Clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 9,
concurrent resolution denouncing the horrors of socialism.
The question is on adoption of the concurrent resolutions. Members will record.
For their mergers. Why not? And that's not even mentioning the stuff that government just gives away. Broadcasting rights, grazing rights on public land, infrastructure rights to logging companies, agribusiness subsidies, the list goes on. Concerning agribusiness though, the largest unsurprisingly secure the most subsidies, particularly for a handful of crops such as wheat and corn, creating massive monocrop farms that don't rotate what's grown on them, exhausting the land and requiring ever more agrochemical input to maintain output. This destroys biodiversity, destroys local environments, allows large farms to take over smaller ones, which in turn depopulates rural areas, resulting in a net negative effect on the country as a whole, but not for profits, of course. This isn't even mentioning the patenting of core and staple agricultural seeds and products, which are then made even more difficult to attain for poor or third world farmers. Not just agribusiness only, though, but airlines, shipping, railroads, along with major exporters are all bailed out or subsidized by your tax money. Just not you, it seems. Walmart has received billions from local governments. Walmart, possibly the largest retail company in the world, has received over $1 billion of public funding in the forms of free land use, water services, sewer system services, tax breaks on income and property, or even just straight up cash. Amazon, Google, Apple, Microsoft, name it, and it's probably gotten many millions, if not more. Nearly every modern facet of civilized existence at this point has been extensively developed and organized using public money, from aeronautics to computers, the internet, biomedical genetic research, and so much more, only for it to be handed off to private business without those same public research platforms or the government gaining a cent. Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Atlas VPN. For a lot of research that I do for my videos, I end up hitting pages that aren't available in my location. That's frustrating, as you can imagine. Geo-restriction really does suck. Link in the video description below and grab this Christmas deal right now. Massive thanks to Atlas VPN for the sponsorship. This is what allows me to pay my editor fairly, so the support is highly appreciated. Alright, back to the video. Large companies, those that get all these handouts, aren't major job producers either, contrary to the propaganda. Small business employs more on a relative basis, yet receives basically nothing from the federal pie. That's of course not a clean slate for small businesses either, they're problematic in their own right, and my earlier video here goes deeper into this. If they face any hardship, they get the lightest help from the government, if at all. Meanwhile, to quote Parenti, when one of the nation's largest banks, Continental Illinois, was on the brink of failure, it received $7.5 billion in federal aid. Under the deregulated thrift market adopted in 1982, savings and loan associations could take any investment risk they wanted with depositors' money, often at great profit to themselves, with the understanding that failures and bad debts would be picked up by the government. In many instances, thrift industry heads funneled deposits into fraudulent deals or directly into their own personal account. When hundreds of thrifts failed, the government spent over $1 trillion to compensate depositors, 90% of whom held accounts of $100,000 or more, in what amounted to the biggest financial bailout scandal in history up to that time. US taxpayers are having to pay $32 billion a year for the Savings and Loan Association's bailouts for a period of 30 years. This pattern exists across nearly all tax-based allowances for private business. Parenti continues. The American states compete with each other in handing out huge sums to attract new businesses and keeping old ones from leaving. State and local governments provide business with low-interest loans, tax breaks, zoning privileges, free land, and waivers on environmental regulations. This costly special treatment is justified as necessary to create new jobs, yet new jobs rarely materialize in any appreciable numbers. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, gave Exxon a $14 million tax break in exchange for a net gain of one single job by Exxon's own estimate. Michigan gave a company $81 million to build a mill that created only 34 permanent jobs, which comes to around $2.3 million per job. Even when everything hits the fan, like in 2008 or COVID, the government bailouts of massive banks and business only go to the very top. Meanwhile, millions lose their jobs and livelihoods without any help in sight. Citigroup, which received up to $45 billion in bailout money, laid off thousands of employees while handing out bonuses of $1 million or more to over 700 managers. The same pattern at every turn. Be a large business, make incredibly risky investments. If they work out, great. If not, the government will bail you out regardless of the cost to the public. Goldman Sachs, which received over $3 billion, Bank of America, which received over $45 billion, it doesn't matter, they all do it. Taxation under capitalism is a method, thus far used only to redistribute wealth upwards. It's no coincidence that the higher up the income ladder you go, the more opportunities you get to minimize, if not outright eliminate, how much tax you need to pay. And no, before you say it, socialism isn't built on taxes, and I have a video that goes into this here. To quote Parenti, in 5 years, 2001 to 2005, tax reductions, mostly to rich individuals and corporations, including cuts on capital gains and dividends, have cost the US Treasury about $860 billion. In the last 2 decades, income from capital ownership, dividends, interests, rents, has risen twice as fast as incomes from salaries and wages. While the rich grow richer, their tax burden grows lighter. The IRS reports that thousands of US residents in the very highest bracket pay less than 5% of their income in taxes, even though their portion of total US income has doubled. People making $60,000 a year pay a much larger proportion of their earnings in federal income tax and social security taxes than a family making $25 million. Things have only gotten worse in the past few years. Many social democracies praised in liberal circles aren't much better. They instead incorporate the major tax burden on salaried professionals making slightly above average income and everyone lower, meanwhile allowing the same loopholes and exemptions for the absolute wealthiest. It doesn't matter where you are, year in and year out you help subsidize the lives and wealth of the absolute richest, meanwhile you and everyone you know gets nothing.
You lose! Good day, sir!
But can't we simply just make our taxes work for us? Some ask. It's a nice idea, but sadly has no reality. As mentioned earlier, the current socioeconomic system has, at its core, capital guiding politics. What this means is that those with the income, property, means of production, etc., are the ones who decide the rules. Increasing a portion of the pie for the rest of us is an incorrect train of thought because number one, we and working people like us made the entire pie in the first place, and two, groveling for concessions from a ruling class only works if that ruling class's power is threatened. Once that threat passes, as working class solidarity and militancy weakens, or is entirely broken by fascism guided by those same interests of capital, all those concessions disappear. This is the reason why all the protections and nets the social democracies of Europe are known for are being stripped day by day. When push comes to shove and hard economic times hit, austerity comes along and speeds up all possible defunding, privatization, selling off, or otherwise destruction of public services that all of society relies on. The one thing that's never touched, though, is the wealth of the wealthiest. The rich get richer isn't just a platitude, it's true. Control through ownership or funding is exercised over major media, educational institutions, film, work culture, property ownership, and practically every other facet of existence that we interact with on a daily basis. Even if someone wealthy isn't directly connected to politics, their class interests, and the sway of their wealth, if threatened, would quickly establish itself firmly in their own camp, minimize or eliminate taxation for themselves, erode labor and environmental laws, crush labor militancy and working class political institutions, sabotage, boycott, attack, and destroy any bastion of working class power. The list goes on. The ruling class begets itself. They go to the same private schools and universities, usually having family or connections on the boards of said institutions. They get the same opportunities out of reach for the rest of us in practical training and employment positions because of that same reason. They have access to account managers and investment coordinators. Many have direct connections to the levers of power too, either through elected office or through donations. Through mostly inherited wealth, they have common financial investments and similar perspectives. If they need to, they even coalesce into advisory boards for policy formation, as in the following Parenti quote. One of the more prominent is the Council of Foreign Relations, started in 1918, now with almost 4,200 members, including representatives from the Rockefeller, Morgan, and DuPont groups. The CFR is funded by the nation's top financial institutions, media networks, and corporations. CFR members have included U.S. presidents, cabinet officers, members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, CIA directors, Federal Reserve officers, key members of Congress, an occasional college or university president, and major media moguls. Almost 1/3 of CFR members are from the corporate business sector and big banks,
Maybe like 10
including
more.
directors from Citigroup, AIG, Disney, ABC, ExxonMobil.
10 more inventories, I think, and I should be good for 50 fire making. I hope.
Dow Jones, Goldman Sachs, Chevron, Texaco, and Halliburton. The CFR helped create the Marshall Plan, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. It advocates a strategic nuclear arsenal and the U.S. military intervention in numerous countries, including the massive escalation in Vietnam. In 1980, the CFR strongly recommended a sharp rise in arms spending and a harder line towards the Soviets. All these positions became official policy. So too the War on Terrorism, a venture vigorously propagated in 2002 by CFR scholars and spokespersons who produced many publications and made hundreds of talk show appearances to promote the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Groups like these embody ruling class interest in a flagrantly honest display, that being the endless pursuit of profit and ease of making profit by any means necessary. That may go from privatization to war if necessary. But that's a topic for the next video. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Peter Lewis, Emil Vakitov, Isaac Anke, Savo, Felix Paulson, Amin Nushad, Abdurrahman, Eamon Berg, Tarek Kapakli,
I want to get to the
Morphe,
beginning,
Michael
the
McGee,
earlier things.
Abdi Adam,
Let's start off
Jemai
with
Bell,
what
I
should
Hate
new
Humans,
Marxists
Robert
do?
L.G. Allen, Turgid.
Introducing the new Method X, a manufacturing workstation powered by Stratasys technology. Print real.
Hi there. Ramadan Kareem to all of you on this blessed month. Excuse the recycled footage, it's better than just a static image for today's topic, in my opinion. Anyways, I get a certain question frequently, and I thought I could quickly answer it in this video, so I don't have to keep writing essay responses to anyone that asks me on Twitter. On that note, if you do ever want to ask me something, feel free to do so, but please on Twitter. The Faults of Previous Socialist Experiments video is coming soon though, don't worry. What I get frequently asked is this. I'm a young Marxist, and I'd like to contribute to the movement somehow. What should I do? I'll break my answer into points, as there isn't just one thing to do in my opinion. Of course, this is, again, just my opinion, so feel free to add to or criticize these points in the comments. Point number 1. First and foremost, I think you should pursue an education. Any education's fine, but in my opinion, the more technical, the better. Some of you may think this is strange, so let me explain my reasoning. We, as Marxists, are working towards a socialist revolution in our respective countries. As a result of every revolution, historically, there has been significant brain drain, that being a net loss of highly educated technical specialists amongst other members of the intelligentsia. This creates a need for what was deemed in the Russian Revolution as bourgeois specialists, those that know the ins and outs of different complex machineries, organization and maintenance of data, difficult and time-consuming engineering work, amongst many other things. There will be no shortage of poets, writers, or political agitators and the like during the revolution. There will, however, be a shortage of people skilled in management, certain medical professionals, many engineering and other technical specialities, etc. If you truly want to be able to contribute to a fledgling revolution, fantastic. But once power is won by the working class, the construction of socialism begins, and that's when the real revolution happens. The more Marxists have tangible skills outside party work, the better, as it would at least somewhat reduce the burden of specialist scarcity. Even if your nation doesn't have a revolution, you could contribute to a new revolution anywhere in the world by either migrating later on to assist with your knowledge, or, if you're in a particularly well-paid field, assisting those movements monetarily. Point number 2. Read theory. As Lenin said, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. There exists 101 reading lists around, but a safe, preliminary reading of the classics is always a good place to start off. Engels' Principles of Communism and Socialism, Utopian Scientific, Marx's Wage, Labor, and Capital, Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, State and the Revolution, Left-Wing Communism, Infantile Disorder, Stalin's Dialectical and Historical Materialism, a book I personally dislike, but that's down to Stalin's very mechanical writing style. Many love it and would disagree with me. Mao's On Practice, On Contradiction, Combat Liberalism, On the Correct Handlings of the Contradictions Among the People, to just name a few. After this, delve headfirst into Marx's works. Capital is an absolute must. Critique of the Gotha Program, The Poverty of Philosophy, and whatever else you feel like after that. Theory is like an endless well. The more you read, the more you'll need to know. But that isn't necessarily a bad thing. As we must have seen by now, there is Marxism and the problem of no one doing the fucking reading. Another important aspect of reading is more intersectional analysis, let's say. Decolonizing literature, or literature focusing on Eurocentrism, like Frantz Fanon, or Edward Said and Samir Amin. Literature discussing settler colonialism, too, is very important, especially if you live in a settler colonial society, the US, Australia, Israel, etc. Works like Sakai's White Settlers, or Ilham Pape's work on Palestine, for example. Also, be sure to be up to date with the economic analysis of the world. Marxism is not a static theory, and is based in the study of the material conditions in the world around us. Zach Cope's work, Argyri's work on unequal exchange, John Smith, Paul Sweezy, and Samir Amin again. There's so many authors you should at least dip your toes with. If you'd like interesting suggestions, then check out my book recommendations videos. Point number 3. Join an organization. If you don't, you're a solitary figure that pretty much can't do anything. A well-organized and educated group can carry out mass work, help with community organizing and defense, help those in need, the homeless, the unemployed, etc. I personally believe the best example of efficient and coherent organization, especially in urban centers, is that of the Black Panthers. Educate yourself and strive to emulate them. There has to be a reading group, party cell, student association, or other form of organization in your area. If there aren't any, well, it might be up to you to make the first. It doesn't even have to be explicitly Marxist per se, as long as the group is critical of capitalism and its byproducts, racism, sexism, etc. Keep in mind though, this is when reading theory is important. You need to have a coherent theoretical line within yourself so you don't just get sucked into whatever this or that group believes. As much as some people don't like to hear it, much of the time there is a right answer and many, many wrong answers to a certain question regarding theory. The necessity of revolution is an example of such a question. If you're employed, organize within your workplace. Join a union, for example. A good book to introduce yourself to unions is Why You Should Be a Trade Unionist by Len Mikulski. Point number 4.
Because your lives are forever entwined.
The fuck?
Arm yourself. Now, I'm not telling you to go LARP with an AK. What I'm saying is the knowledge of handling a weapon and knowing your way around all aspects comfortably will never be a detriment. In fact, it only has upsides. Living in Iraq, I have personally benefited from such knowledge, and it doesn't take much for the information to become super helpful wherever you are too. If you happen to live in a country where you have abundant access to ranges, organizations based around their use, etc., then you have no excuse. The SRA in the US is an example of such an organization with a socialist leaning.
Very true.
I believe they have branches all over the US, but don't quote me on that. Consult their website and join.
They're spread out pretty far and wide.
Country where it's impossible
but
to get
they're
hold of
decent.
anything, well then I guess theoretical knowledge is
decently
better
around.
than nothing. There is no shortage of videos on YouTube in that case. I'm unaware of any country that bans it outright, as even the more strict European countries still have licensing you can do, which, although time-consuming and maybe even a little pricey in places, is still nonetheless worth it in my opinion. And point number 5. Tone down the zeal. Almost everyone, especially when they get into something new, tend to be a little overzealous, many times bordering on obnoxious. A silly personal example is, I'm not very into fiction or stories or sci-fi stuff, etc. I can sit and read the most boring and technical works for hours, but hand me a novel and 10 pages in, I'll give up. It just doesn't work with me. That was until I stumbled across a light novel series named Overlord. I think I finished that in under a week or so. I was insufferable for that week. Point being, Marxism has fantastic explanatory power for the world around us. Why capitalism is the way it is, and also comes with logical and well-reasoned theory for how we can change what we perceive to be injustice. A lot of the time, your first readings of these things really does blow you away, and as a result you become almost fanatical, getting into hour-long essay arguments on the internet, at work, or school, and just generally not being a very good representative of Marxism, until you finally cool down. My advice is, calm down. The time you spend arguing is better spent reading theory. And that's about it from my perspective. If you like this video, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, it really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Sid Singh, Mass Strike Now, Garlic Bread, Mark Habinski, John Poland, Ad Democracy Expert, Alan Plum, Andy Haywood, Brennan Ruffing, Dale McFarlane, L.A. Gerzon, Eric G, Grammar Antifa, Granola Joe, Industrial Robot, Jedi Davion, John Bernstein, Khan, Nick Ringheim Lunde, Liam Sapanen, Libertarian Stalinist, Manda, Mikar Gropoulos, Amar Abdul-Jabbar, Ray Hogginson, Renkel Lancaster, Ring, Sasha Novaseta, Soviet Mystic, Sassy M, Ted Teddington Tedsville, The Turkish Trotskyist, Tristan Durian, Zatarani, Zarin Arsin, Justin Perdomo, Eugene Simonovsky, Job, Parker Cushing, Malinov, Comrade Benito, August Nilsson, Nobody, Jovian Archiver, Pauline McDeesey, Michael R.W., Ferritan, Scott Radburn, My Little Stalin, Calypso Soltis, Brandon Prasad, Judah Drury, James Kavanagh, Toki Mukai, Comrade Pengu, and of course Charles. Thank you, Charles. I'll see you in the next one.
It's time to take the next leap in Wi-Fi.
We can go to that one.
Introducing Orbi.
This will undoubtedly be a controversial video, not
Oh.
because of its contents per se, but by the reaction it may elicit in some sectors of the left.
Oh.
There exists a trend, mostly within the white Western left, to deride or outright dismiss many socialist experiments, either by solely focusing on and magnifying their errors, or by explaining away their triumphs. This being a trend of white Western leftists is simply based on my own observation. I have never seen it from black and brown comrades in the third world, and only rarely see it from black and brown comrades in the first. Maybe that's more of a commentary on leftist organizations in the West than anything else, but I digress. Before I start, let me first define what I mean. Left-wing anti-communism is a trend we see that simply dislikes and disregards almost every successful socialist experiment to have ever existed. Now, we can debate whether they were the true pure socialism trademark that the pure socialists have in their minds or not. That isn't the point. These were nonetheless experiments with no...
So give me 1 second, I will be right back. I'm going to throw this on. Okay. Okay, I'm back. Hold on.
No former grand blueprint or guide that attempted to organize society along lines different to capitalism. They were successful, in my opinion, in doing so, and genuinely stood as the greatest and most long-standing threat to global capitalism to this day. Even their memory stirs fear in the hearts of the ruling class, and that's why, to them, they must be demonized at every turn. However, the left-wing anti-communists will not only reject these experiments, or damn them as the monstrosities that perverted some pure socialism they've dreamt up, but in some cases claim that we don't have anything to learn from them, either. This trend is almost fully supported by the quote-unquote approved, meaning controlled opposition, leftist academics and writers that exist. The Noam Chomskys and the George Orwells of the world. Not only this, but the trend is fully supported by the capitalist establishment, with glowing reviews of books published, and runs and reruns of the books either by the CIAs or Harvards of the respective countries. Now, where do you see this? Am I making this up? No, of course not. If you've read enough literature on the Bolshevik Revolution, for example, you'd quickly notice the pattern of lionizing the first few years of the revolution up until maybe 1922 or 23, and then afterwards severe condemnation. A lot of this mixed with denouncements of Stalinist dictatorship or Stalinist bureaucracy or a Stalinist soap dispenser that doesn't work all that well. This trend very easily fits with the left-wing anti-communist paradigm, as it glorifies the weakest, most fragmented, and most uncertain time period in Soviet history, in the guise of supporting worker democracy, which, by the way, didn't magically evaporate after 1923. This followed along with an absolute lack of nuance when it comes to what had to be done after those first few years of severe lack of effective organization. Had the revolution failed by 1923, ironically, by the very steps they wished the revolution would take instead, they'd be praising it to the heavens to this day. But no, the revolution did not fail then, and had to be consolidated. It had to build up a strong army to protect it from foreign invasion. It had to build up a strong internal security apparatus in order to protect itself from sabotage. It had to ration due to sanctions. It had to maximize living standards for everyone equally instead of a small clique at the top, like under capitalism, and so left something to be desired. Its failure was the fact that it succeeded in the eyes of the left-wing anti-communists. This does not mean, by the way, that I fully agree or disagree with the decisions taken by the Soviets in that crucial early period or afterwards, either. What it does mean is that now we have a tangible tradition of what could be done, its consequences, and from that, all the lessons that could be learned. The difference, though, is that these left-wing anti-communists, in all their arrogance, throw out blanket statements of they should have done this or they should have done that, as if the situation were that easy. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were not stupid, and nor were they some strange conception of bourgeois morality as evil. They were highly intelligent, motivated revolutionaries who, along with the workers and peasants, attempted to build something never before seen on Earth, in the most trying of circumstances. If this does not absolve them, then I'll sit back and await the eternal wisdom of these new comrades to establish the perfect revolution, with its perfect socialism. Interesting that the groups that can't organize a reading circle think they're capable of this. A connected point is, this is an incredibly common phenomenon with left-wing anti-communists, the lionization of every revolution that doesn't succeed. The reason this happens is, because of those revolutions failing, they never had to contend with actually attempting to build a stable and prosperous socialism. If they weren't immediately crushed, they would have had to deal with every other hardship, both material and theoretical, that the socialist experiments had to deal with, and then they quickly would have been relegated to that same category. The category of every other Stalinist bureaucracy they deride to this day. Logically, since these left-wing anti-communists seem to denounce every gain and loss of the former socialist experiments, there must be some substance to their criticism. They clearly paint themselves as knowing better. They should have done this, they should have done that, it bounds in their rhetoric. If that's the case, where are their revolutions? Where are their contributions to Marxist theory? Where are their organizations? You have to remember, when it comes to our leftist friends criticizing these movements, something that's always missing is nuance. Not everything was done perfectly, according to these comrades that have never been in that position, nor do they provide alternative solutions, aside from incredibly vague platitudes. Another thing to understand is why there even exists such rampant anti-communism within the left, especially within academic spaces. Putting aside the fact that, due to the century-long taboo on positive Marxist coverage, many liberals have infiltrated the space. We need to also examine how controlled media of all kinds is under capitalist society. The New York Times and other media organizations pass articles, parsed through capitalist social hegemony, to be reviewed by the CIAs and NSAs prior to publishing. And similarly, academic publishing houses block anything with even a remotely positive spin on a socialist experiment as a whole. Operation Mockingbird never ended, and you'd be naive to believe it did. Peer reviewers will reject positive journal entries, and publishing houses will outright refuse to look at transcripts if they dare present any evidence without frequent inflammatory damnations of the Soviet Union, Stalin, and socialism in general, regardless of the relevance. Even highly niche works, like Tauger's famine research, or J.R. Getty's research on the Great Terror, cannot escape this. Many times, they have to reaffirm their anti-communist credentials in multi-page prefaces, as if to reassure the reader that they in fact hold no love for the Soviet Union and socialism, and almost apologize for the fact that the evidence points to a nuanced and not cartoonishly evil reality. Nothing is allowed to be published unless it's the most obscure, boring specialist work, and even then, it can only be published by explicitly left-wing publishers or specialist journals. In such an environment of unparalleled freedom, is it surprising that these left-wing anti-communists internalize the hegemony of the ruling class? This leads into the fact that this is more or less prevalent only in the West. I hear these arguments and condemnations almost exclusively from mostly Western, mostly white voices. This doesn't mean that in the Third World, Marxists are ignorant. No, far from it. Marx, Lenin, Mao, hell, even Bordiga is sold by street booksellers here in Iraq. If anything, those in the Third World, by their personal experience, understand the necessity of nuance and the reasons for what some may deem authoritarian. A meaningless phrase, mind you. In my own country of Iraq, a socialist revolution would do more than enough to offend the sensibilities of our misguided Western comrades. The things that need to be done would have to be done harshly, swiftly, and with the local shortages and issues taken into account. This would result in a socialism that, although imperfect, as humanity is itself, will result in a net positive for people's lives and their children's lives. This is more than enough for the left-wing anti-communists to damn this hypothetical in its cradle. The question of racism cannot be ignored. If you've paid attention, you'd quickly notice how the condemnation of Third World black and brown experiments are almost immediate. Yet, when the lukewarm social democrat that supported the bombing of Yugoslavia runs on a platform of free healthcare, it's as if he's given them the world. Immediately, all his flaws and the consequences of his wildly incorrect theoretical line are excused away, placated, or outright ignored. When the social democrat wants to bring in very benign reform that can only with difficulty be put in place and very easily be stripped away, these comrades sing their praises. But mention Castro, or Lenin, or whoever else actually managed to establish an order that benefited not only their own nation's people, but countless millions worldwide, and you'll hear shouts of evil, dictator, mixed with smug dismissiveness. A frequent claim is that the evil communists wanted only power for themselves, that Lenin and Stalin, Mao, Castro, Ho Chi Minh, and all the others were simply power-hungry brutes that wanted nothing than to hold the population under their thumb. How one gains power by fighting for the rights of the powerless is never explained. Lenin was the son of a petty noble. Stalin had a promising career ahead of him after graduating from a seminary. Mao was the son of a wealthy farmer and was to inherit his father's vast tracts of land to make a very comfortable life for himself. Castro, too, was the son of a wealthy landowner, and he too was to inherit his father's lucrative sugar plantations. Yet, the first thing he did was nationalize his own family's farm before any other. The first things all of them did was repudiate that which gave them all that privilege in the first place, in order to fight for the unheard majority. How you can condemn figures that opted to fight brutal and difficult lives for the unlikely possibility of socialism happening within their own lifetimes as evil is beyond me. This is no great man theory. I am but trying to absolve these individuals as history has already absolved them. If our misguided comrades cannot see through the mist of capitalist hegemony is a matter of education and nuance, nothing else. Remember, they condemn a name, a Lenin or a Castro, but in reality, in their misguidance, they are condemning the millions that supported those movements as well. I repeat this as I always do. If leftists in the West achieved 1/10 what former socialist experiments had, they would elate themselves to the stars. This is not to say you cannot criticize those experiments. Far from it, they should be criticized. But there's a time place, and format this criticism must take place in, and that criticism must be based in evidence and good faith. It must be grounded in nuance and an understanding of the circumstances. This is the criticism honest Marxists take part in, unlike the eternal traitors of our movement such as Orwell, who attacked the Soviet Union at the height of its war against the fascist menace. Yes, the darling of the CIA, the same Orwell that reported Marxists, gays, and black agitators to Britain's secret police. If you hold Orwell in any positive regard, you need to reassess your political inclinations. This leads me to another point. Due to the unending onslaught against the memory of socialism, those that defend examples of former socialist experiments look like blind admirers of those systems. I understand. But that's only because they have been forced to be on the defensive their entire existence, practically. Marxist-Leninists are not blind lovers of those socialist experiments, as left-wing anti-communists are blind detractors. If you doubt this, join a Marxist-Leninist space and ask for criticism. I can assure you, you'll get more than you bargained for. The most scathing criticism of Marxist-Leninist experiments come from MLs themselves. If you continue to doubt this, then stay tuned, as the next video I upload will roughly outline the faults and mistakes of 20th century socialism as I see them. Nonetheless, defending our heritage, while understanding its flaws and learning its lessons, is infinitely better than being a spineless coward that crumbles against the most superficial pressure, and as a result denounces the experiments in their totality only because Red Scare CIA propaganda told them to. This entire topic and so much more is dealt with in Michael Parenti's excellent work, Black Shirts and Reds. I cannot recommend this book enough, honestly. It's short, just 160 pages or so. You could knock it out in an afternoon. If there is a single thing you should take from this video, it's that you should go and read Black Shirts and Reds. Thank you for watching. If you like what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to James Kavanaugh, Toki Mukai, At Democracy Expert, Alan Plum, Brennan Ruffing, Daniel Williams, Dal McFarlane, Ellie Gerzon, Eric G, Grammar Antifa, Granola Joe, Industrial Robot, Jedi Davion, John Bernstein, Jonathan Chavez, Khan, Nutring Imlande, Liam Sepanen, Libertarian Stalinist, Manda, Mikar Gropoulos, Amar Abdul-Jabbar, Ray Hogginson, Ren Kel Blancaster, Ring, Sasha Novoseta, Soviet Mystic, Sassy M, Ted Teddington Tedsville. Hi there. In this video, as promised, I'll be discussing some of the issues of previous socialisms. This will span many different nations and time periods in order to cover as many interesting points as possible, as briefly as possible. Of course, I'll be providing a little context to faults as they didn't occur in a vacuum, and almost all of them happened as a direct result to impending threats or serious difficulties that were near impossible to overcome at the time. This is by no means an exhaustive list. These are just quick examples of faults that could be learned from. One of the first points, albeit a smaller one, is competing with the West. One of the earliest faults, in my mind, this point applies more to the USSR than smaller socialist countries, but nonetheless is still a mistake. The USSR started from a position similar to that of Brazil, or the Middle East and North Africa region, more appropriately the West Asia and North Africa region. For it to go from a semi-feudal backwater to a spacefaring superpower in a few decades is incredibly impressive. Nonetheless, it framed itself as the alternative to American capitalism. This framing, itself, as the competing equal to the US, was a grave mistake since it immediately made the USSR seem outclassed in some regards, which is to be expected since the two nations started from incredibly different circumstances. The second point being military overspending. Defending your borders is one thing, attempting to stay in parity with the US is another. It's completely understandable, based on Soviet historical experience, why they always maintained such a large, sophisticated military, but that did eat into the Soviet Union's ability to further improve the lives of its people, and also for scientific discovery. Many of the best and brightest minds were pushed into military development with noticeable effects. An alternative that makes sense to me, although I by no means have all the facts, would have been to remain untouchable through nuclear weapons, rather than keeping such a well-maintained standing army. Whether this is the correct course or not, this is something that will require serious study in the future. The only thing clear is that the USSR erred in this regard. Point number 3. Lack of economic diversity in smaller socialist nations. Many smaller socialist countries, sometimes under the advice of the USSR or on their own accord, maintained an economy with a very narrow level of diversity. Cuba was such an example, with a focus on agricultural produce, mainly sugar. Only recently, within the past 20 years, has Cuba began more heavily diversifying, in light of the special period. This also somewhat applies to certain smaller Soviet republics, like Uzbekistan, with cotton, for example. This was not a rule, however, and certain countries, Bulgaria, the GDR, not to mention the USSR as a whole, etc., had incredibly diverse and well-developed economies. This kind of leads me into the issue of big brother socialist countries encouraging what they consider good strategy on other nations. Essentially, the development of self-sufficient industry and high-diversity economies, coupled with narrow areas of specialization, would allow for, what I believe to be, more fraternal cooperation between socialist nations, in which every single one can nonetheless stand on their own for all basic needs. This existed in one sense in the former socialist countries, but not nearly to a sufficient level. Point number 4. Not enough light industry. An issue that arose right from the start of the USSR was the divide between heavy and light industry. Heavy industry lends very well to the immediate needs of the nation as a whole, allowing for the production of heavy machinery, steel and iron, resources for infrastructure development, building material, and, of course, military technology. This is what's required to develop housing, roads, hospitals, a strong military, and almost everything else required on a national level. Light industry, on the other hand, is what's necessary for our needs as individuals. Wood products, home appliances, textiles, all sorts of food products, cleaning products, things for personal hygiene, amongst many other things. I'm reminded of an old Soviet professor that said to her students, "You complain that we produce Sputniks and not lingerie." That, in essence, is the divide. Although all of us can explicitly admit that the conquering of space and the development of national infrastructure is best, we cannot ignore the fact that, for many, happiness is in the small things. Beauty creams and toasters and variety in textiles have a much larger impact on the satisfaction of a population than the fact that we have built a new dam or that we have taken images of the far side of our galaxy. In hindsight, the Soviet strategy on focusing on heavy industry was right, as Bukharin's emphasis on light industry would have resulted in a Soviet Union with a much weaker capacity to firstly absorb the German invasion and secondly to carry the war to victory. Had the Soviet leadership not emphasized heavy industry, you and I may be speaking German right now, and also dead because we're communists. Despite the fact, the very emphasis on heavy industry and a relatively smaller emphasis on light industry resulted in some level of discontent among certain sectors of the Soviet population. In fact, many people who had a problem with Soviet society complained of primarily one thing: lack of variety or quality in consumer goods. Humans are strange creatures. This, of course, was the strategy of the USSR, and hence was imported without much thought into many socialist countries, resulting in similar shortages, or inadequacies, of consumer goods, and a surplus of heavy industry, for example in countries like Romania or Poland. Point number 5. Not enough democratic participation. Of course, the modern bourgeois peddled notion that there was no democracy in the former socialist experiments is blatantly false. There was democracy of a different kind, a proletarian democracy, which resulted in societies far more democratic than any Western liberal democracy.
I haven't had a flame spirit in a
Cuba
while.
is a living example of said socialist democracy. Regardless, just because the Soviet Union or the GDR was more democratic than the US, a fact only those blind to ideology deny, does not mean that those nations were without fault. There was definitely more room for workplace democracy, as the state it was in the USSR was relatively underdeveloped and unsatisfactory for socialist expectations. The system of trade union representation was not as independent as one would hope, and there were way too many rubber stamping committees to be comfortable. Of course, all this arose from this or that necessity, but it's something we must learn to avoid in the future. On the other hand, most of the issues I currently have with Soviet political democracy have been corrected, or are in the process of being corrected, in Cuba. A great book on this topic is Cuba and Its Neighbors, Democracy in Motion by Arnold August. However, other positions certain groups within the left take issue with, I still defend. Primarily the existence of only one single party, as well as democratic centralism. I'm only mentioning these for posterity's sake. Many leftists disagree with these points, and not all socialist countries are single party. The GDR and DPRK are notable exceptions. Point number 6. Restrictions on cultural expression. This is a particularly severe point. Considering the USSR, there was a strong drive at first for local cultural expression, the development of local languages, the maintenance of local traditions and religions, amongst other things. Around the mid-30s, a subtle change occurred, with local language scripts being changed to Cyrillic, for example. Not that big of a deal, but still not ideal. The biggest changes occurred during the Brezhnev era and onward. Passive Russification took place, in that there was never any repression of a particular ethnicity, but in order to climb higher in life, as well as through the dissemination of Russian culture throughout the republics, many mastered Russian instead of their native tongues, adopted Russian traditions, started naming their children Russian names, and for all intents and purposes became Russian. This, combined with the moving of Russian technical experts into the small republics, spread some level of discontent, and directly contributed to the reactionary petty nationalisms of non-Russian ethnicities towards the end of the USSR. This reached its tip when in Kazakhstan, Kazakhs not only became a minority in their own republic, but the Central Committee of the Kazakh branch of the Communist Party had not a single Kazakh on it. I don't think I need to explain how grave a mistake this was. In my personal opinion, this was one of the worst, most easily avoided mistakes of the USSR. In another vein, Albania also had incredibly strange and unnecessarily repressive limits on cultural expression. An example of this would be the name list, an official list of first names you could name your child, which were supposedly neutral, purely so-called Albanian names. Mild repression hit what we would consider Christian names, but the blunt of the repression, similar with every other aspect in Albania, hit the Muslim population. People with traditionally Islamic names were forced to change their name to neutral Albanian, or ironically, and I believe somewhat intentionally, to Christian ones. This has absolutely no need and is honestly so fucking stupid. There are other examples of this sort of thing, and again, I don't think I need to explain why this is wrong and why we should learn from it in the future. Point number 7. Repression of religious practice. Building up from the previous point, the severe repression of religious expression was one of the, if not the worst mistakes of the former socialist experiments. Religion is something that will always remain in one way or another, particularly in historically religious communities. Religious communities of all types survived and adapted from slave societies to feudal or other pre-capitalist formations through capitalism and will definitely endure in one way or another during socialism and eventually communism. For a socialist government to not only deny public religious expression of any kind, but to also actively repress it with militant atheist gangs wandering the countryside, yes, this happened, and active anti-religious education in schools only lends reactionary forces power. Religion is an incredibly powerful tool, and every religious tradition lends itself very well to socialist ideals. If one were intelligent, they'd rather utilize religion as a driving force for participation in socialist society, and wield it as a weapon against other sorts of reaction. If you don't do that, what ends up happening is that this tool will fall into the hands of reactionary forces, who are highly motivated and usually well-armed and supported by foreign powers, to undermine the power of the socialist state. That, and also the massive discontent amongst religious masses. An often ignored aspect for local discontent in the Central Asian republics was this very issue, and it directly aided those espousing petty nationalism with calls for us being able to practice our own religion in our own country, finally. I have heard too many stories from people I know having to secretly baptize their children, or people having to hide religious texts in false walls and secret pits in fear of the authorities. My own father, who studied many years in the USSR, on a trip to Azerbaijan, had people follow him to his hotel room, begging him to teach them how to recite the Quran properly. This is not what socialism should stand for, and is definitely something that deserves the most severe condemnation. If you want humanity, the vast majority of which is religious in one form or another, behind your political cause, you need to have a coherent and positive religious strategy. Don't forget, the reasons many Muslims supported the Bolsheviks early on is because they promised they defend their mosques and their right to worship. Point number 8. Deportations. Another severe point of criticism. This happened in the USSR during the German invasion with a select group of nationalities. The idea being that certain reactionary sections of said populations either collaborated with the Germans, were planning on collaborating, or were under suspicion of collaborating. Now, for the actions of a few hundred of a certain population, tens of thousands were forcibly deported to other areas of the USSR. These actions were not done based on material analysis, nor were these actions absolutely necessary. The only somewhat saving grace is the sheer barbarity of the war necessitated such actions, but still, the lesson for the future is clear. A correct and Marxist assessment of a similar situation in the future should result in a very different decision. Point number 9. Purges. Now, the purges are such an incredibly complex topic, and I won't go into all the complexities right now. Suffice to say, though, the common image of the purges in the West is very, very wrong. They were not the actions of some totalitarian godman in order to, quote-unquote, consolidate power, or any other one of their favorite tropes. The reality of the purges was, in fact, way worse. Essentially, a fifth column existed within the Soviet Union, and it attempted to bring down the Soviet government and essentially install a military dictatorship in support of Germany. Unsurprisingly, this fifth column was supported by Germany, as well as many other elements outside the USSR. The real failure on the part of the Soviet leadership was allowing a fifth column such as this to form in the first place. Not only that, but the extent of its influence was so far that it controlled vital aspects of the military, the internal security apparatus, and even parts of the party. The very existence of this means mistakes were done. Certain people were either protected from suspicion for some period, or simply the party wasn't nearly vigilant enough in screening its members, in particular those with vital positions. This same issue reared its head towards the end of the USSR as well, when not so much a fifth column, but definitely an anti-Soviet and anti-socialist group managed to form, grow, and eventually occupy vital positions within the government, prime example being Yeltsin. Paradoxically, active purges are good at weeding out these elements, and were done since Lenin's time. How you can reconcile active purges with significant vigilance, such that no issues like those in the 30s arise again, I don't know though. Point number 10, limitations of planning. This is a minor point that has far-reaching consequences. In the USSR and many other socialist countries, planning was done by complex calculations carried out by hand, which meant that it would take a long time to develop plans of a sophisticated level. Because of this limitation, at the most only 10,000 different units within the economy were planned for in the USSR. This amount is laughable nowadays, as a regular smartphone can plan for many times that, and modern supercomputers can plan unfathomably complex, multi-year plans for entire nations. The issue is that, even with the development of computers, the Soviet Union stuck to small-scale planning, and later on broke up the Central Planning Committee into many regional planning committees with non-binding plans, essentially becoming directives that technically don't have to be followed. This happened even though revolutionary new methods for planning with the limitations of the time had taken place, for example with Project Cybersyn in Allende's Chile. In fact, Chile's Cybersyn project was only a small-scale imagining of Glushkov's OGAS system. This system was to essentially be an internet system that spanned the entire territory of the Soviet Union and would have radically eased as well as developed the planning capacity of the USSR. Not only this, but would have most likely developed into a civilian internet network for the spread of information, much like the modern internet. However, we're talking about the 1960s here. It never happened, partly due to an ossified bureaucracy, but also due to the sheer cost. Of course, hindsight is 2020, but I'm convinced that had OGAS been developed, not only would the USSR still exist today, it would have surpassed the US as the largest economy on Earth even sooner than predicted. Based on the 1980s numbers, the USSR was going to be the #1 economic power by 2005. An excellent article on this topic is Internet, Why the Soviet Union Did Not Build a Nationwide Computer Network. Number 11, transitioning to a profit-based enterprise system. Among the many mistakes of Khrushchev and the Soviet administration of the time, which include regional planning committees and the selling off of the machine and tractor stations to collective farms, is the transition of the Soviet enterprise to a profit-based system in order to measure productivity, rather than output, quality, or relative performance to economic plans. This created a precedent for profit over more valid criteria in certain sectors of the economy, incentivized the hiring and maintenance of managers that got the most profit and hence cultivated a capitalist mindset among Soviet managerial sectors. Unsurprisingly, Yeltsin was climbing the ranks during this crucial period. Two good books on this topic include Bill Bland's Restoration of Capitalism in the Soviet Union and Martin Nicolaus's book of the same name. Point number 12, ossification of the Politburo. Somewhat linked to the previous point is the ossification of Soviet leadership, which was a grave error. The average age of members of the Central Committee, primarily, was uncomfortably high. Similarly, although to a lesser extent, this issue was also present with members of the Supreme Soviet. A self-explanatory point, and in my opinion, a more frequent rotation of leadership, at most levels, and a higher percentage of the young can only lead to good for socialist political structures. Point number 13, the Comintern. Another very complicated point, but one I can go over quickly. The idea of coordinating party work and strategy across nations is an incredibly attractive one. However, it suffers from a flaw. One dominant socialist nation will dominate this strategy, in the example of the USSR, and will, unsurprisingly, result in some bad decisions. An example of said decision is the strange coordination of the Chinese Revolution. Such issues, as well as the post-war period in general, caused the Comintern to be abolished. Ideally for the future, a more, let's say, horizontal form of organization can be built up, where a panel of socialist nations and parties switch out leadership and organization. This has many flaws as well, but is just an idea I'm throwing out there. Point number 14, over-bureaucratization. Unsurprisingly, a massive nation such as the USSR needed some level of bureaucracy. This is something all transitionary and socialist nations require for effective organization. But, at the end of the day, when there are too many bureaucrats, inefficiencies occur and a hardened crust of them will make dynamic change more difficult. In line with Lenin's awkwardly titled Better Fewer but Better, the solution is essentially, well, better fewer but better. Many of the former issues that existed can be fixed with modern computing, but nonetheless this is something we do need to consider. Now there are many other criticisms to be made, but this video is getting long enough. If I didn't mention something you want to hear, either this video has dragged on long enough or because it isn't really something to criticize. There are a few books I can recommend, of course, the first and foremost being Parentes, Black Shirts, and Reds, again, which you have to read. It discusses many other issues I haven't even touched. On the purges, the works of J. Archgetty and Grover Fur are excellent, and you should check those out. For a more detailed analysis on which flaws contributed to the legal dissolution of the USSR, take a look at the book Socialism Betrayed. An interesting but old book on the early propaganda war, as well as other sorts of sabotage and antagonism against the USSR, is The Great Conspiracy from 1946. A quick Google search will bring up the PDF. As for Soviet democracy, you can look up Pat Sloan's book, titled Soviet Democracy, anything written by Albert Szymanski, for example, Is the Red Flag Flying, or Human Rights in the USSR, Webb's book, called Soviet Communism and New Civilization, or an old book titled The Soviet Form of Popular Government, which explains it in a nicely detailed level. As for planning and cybernetics, look up Cockshot's work, for example, Towards New Socialism, and Medina's book titled Cybernetic Revolutionaries, Technology and Politics in Allende's Chile. That's enough for now. If you like what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Alex Benishek, Carmad Goat, D. Lang, Darius A. Berndahl, James Kavanaugh, John Bernston, John Poland, No L, Nobody,
Celebrate this moment and every moment. Shop the Valentine's Day sale.
Hello. In a slight change of programming, I'll be discussing Marx's book Wage, Labor, and Capital before I upload the other videos I mentioned earlier. In this first section of the book, Marx discusses wages, what they are, and how they relate to the worker. So, let's get started. First of all, what is a wage? Let's assume the employer is a capitalist for now. They're not always capitalists, but for the continuity of this video, let's just assume that they are. If you ask any worker what a wage is, they'd say that is the amount of money which their employer, the capitalist, pays them for a certain amount or period of work. So, how much money the worker gets for either how much time he spends working or how much of something, for example chairs, he produces. So, one would assume that if the capitalist pays a worker a certain amount of money, for example $20, for a certain amount of work, then you could basically say that the capitalist buys the labor of the worker with money. The worker sells his labor to the capitalist, and the capitalist buys the worker's labor with money, that $20 we spoke about. This is in fact wrong. The worker doesn't sell his labor, but in fact sells his labor power. Now, this seems like a small difference, but it makes all the change in the world. This labor power is bought by the capitalist for a certain agreed-upon amount of time, for example, a day, a week, a month, etc. After the capitalist has bought the labor power of the worker, the capitalist uses this labor power by making the worker work for the agreed-upon time, for example, a day, a week, a month, etc. Here's where it gets interesting, though. With the same amount of money, let's stick to $20 for now, with the same amount of money the capitalist uses to buy the labor power of the worker, he could have alternatively used it to buy, for example, a few kilos of sugar, or flour, or any other commodity. The $20 with which the capitalist bought, for example, a few kilos of sugar, is the price of those few kilos of sugar. The $20 with which the capitalist bought, for example, 12 hours worth of labor power from the worker, is the price of those 12 hours worth of labor power from the worker. What can we take from this then? Well, labor power is a commodity, no more and no less than those few kilos of sugar. The only difference is, one is measured with a scale, and the other is measured by the clock. This commodity of the workers, labor power, is exchanged by the workers for the commodity of the capitalist, that commodity being money. Not only this, but this exchange has a particular ratio, a certain amount of money for a certain amount of labor power, measured in time of course. For example, for $20, 10 hours of weaving cloth. Naturally, these $20 also represent all other commodities the worker can buy with $20. So, in actuality, the worker has exchanged his commodity, labor power, for commodities of all kinds, at a certain ratio, of course. By paying the worker these $20, the capitalist has given the worker a certain amount of vegetables, bread, cloth, etc., worth $20, in return for his day's work. Thus, these $20 are in fact an expression in which the commodity of labor power is exchanged for other commodities, what Marx called the exchange value of labor power. Now, the exchange value of a commodity in money is called price. Price is simply the estimation of exchange value in money. Wages, on the other hand, are simply the special name for the price of labor power. So, wages are simply the name for the price of labor power. To help with the understanding of these concepts, I'll use the excellent example Marx himself gave. Let's take an example of a worker, for example a weaver. This is someone who weaves yarn and other materials into cloth. The capitalist provides the weaver with all material and machinery he requires. The weaver puts himself to work, and from that material, like yarn, cloth is made. At the end of this, the capitalist takes this cloth and sells it for example, $200. Some fancy cloth, I know. Now, this weaver gets a wage of $20, let's say. This $20 the weaver gets in return for his work. Did it come from the cloth being sold? Of course not. Way before the cloth is sold, before it reaches market, and maybe before it is even completed, the weaver gets his wage. So, the capitalist doesn't pay the wage of the weaver out of the money he will get from selling the cloth, but out of the money he already has on hand. Now, maybe the capitalist didn't find anyone who wanted the cloth. Maybe it was incredibly profitable. None of this concerns the weaver, however. As mentioned previously, the capitalist uses his wealth to buy the labor power of the worker, just as the capitalist uses his wealth to buy raw materials, like yarn, and the machinery needed to make the cloth. After the capitalist has bought all of these commodities, including the labor power of the weaver, he uses all of these things he now owns to create the cloth. Our good friend, the weaver, too is one of these instruments of production, one of the instruments of labor. In this regard, he is no different from the machinery, and has no more of a share in the product, the cloth, or in the price of the cloth than the machinery itself has. Hence, wages are not a share of the worker in the commodities produced by the worker himself. I'll say that again. Wages are not a share of the worker in the commodities he produced. Instead, wages are part of the already existing commodities with which the capitalist buys a certain amount of labor power from the worker. Therefore, labor power, as we have already established, is a commodity which our worker sells to the capitalist. Why does the worker do this? Simple, to survive. As Marx said, and I quote, "The putting of labor power into action, the work, is the active expression of the laborer's own life, and this life activity he sells to another person, the capitalist, in order to secure the necessary means of life. His life activity, therefore, is but a means of securing his own existence. He works that he may keep alive. He does not count the labor itself as part of his own life. It is rather a sacrifice of his life. It is a commodity that he has auctioned off to another. The product of his activity, therefore, is not the aim of his activity. What he produces for himself is not the silk that he weaves, not the gold that he draws up the mining shaft, nor the palace that he builds. What he produces for himself is wages, and the silk, the gold, and the palace are resolved for him in a certain quantity of necessaries of life, perhaps into a cotton jacket, into copper coins, and into a basement dwelling. And the laborer, who for 12 hours long weaves, turns, builds, shovels, breaks stone, and so on, is this 12 hours weaving, spinning, turning, building, shoveling, stone breaking, etc., regarded by him as a manifestation of life? As life? Quite the contrary. Life for him begins when this activity ceases, at the table, at the tavern, in bed. The 12 hours' work, on the other hand, has no meaning for him as weaving, turning, building, and so on, but only as earnings, which enable him to sit down at the table, to take his seat in the tavern, and to lie down in bed. In this chapter, Marx goes on to talk about how labor power was not always a commodity. Labor itself was not always wage labor, or free labor, as in you aren't a slave. For example, a slave does not sell his labor power to the slave master, no more than the ox sells his labor to the farmer, says Marx. The slave, along with his labor power, was given wholesale to the slave master once he was sold to the slave master. The slave is himself a commodity. The serf, on the other hand, sells only part of his labor power. Rather than the serf getting something, like a wage, from the landowner, the relationship is turned upside down, with the serf giving something as a tribute to the landowner. The free laborer, like our weaver we spoke of earlier, sells himself completely, but for fractions of a time. He sells 8, 10, 12, etc. hours of his life from one day to the next to the highest bidder, the one with wealth, raw materials, and the means of life, the capitalist. In this regard, the worker doesn't belong to a master, like the slave, or to the soil, like the serf, but rather 8 or 10 or 12, etc. hours of his daily life belong to whoever buys them. The worker provides himself to the capitalist as much as the capitalist desires, and the capitalist gets rid of the worker whenever he sees fit, the very moment the worker becomes of no use to him. The worker, on the other hand, cannot leave this whole class of buyers. The worker cannot leave the capitalist class because they are his only source of income, his only source of livelihood. The only alternatives become wage slavery, the sale of himself to the capitalist, or death. Not really a voluntary transaction, as the capitalists say. The worker does not belong to this or that capitalist, as Marx says, but rather belongs to the capitalist class as a whole, and his only role is to find a buyer of his labor power within this capitalist class. Now, let's get talking about how wages are determined, then. Price, as we have said, is the expression in money of the exchange value of a commodity. A wage is the special term for the price of labor power, which itself is a commodity as we have already established. Naturally, then, wages are determined by the same laws and mechanisms that determine the price of any other commodity. The question now is, how is the price of a commodity determined then? Well, I'll get onto that in the next video. I hope you found this video helpful. I'll be uploading the things I mentioned in an earlier video in a little bit. And that's about it. Thanks for watching. Hello. Today I'll be talking about
If we're awarded the grant, we will use it on rent in order to open up a few more avenues for us to expand our business.
Train one of our guys, offer more services and more, get more customers in the door here to the shop.
Just stuff we weren't really able to do with the...
Hello. This is part 2 of my series on Marx's work, Wage, Labor, and Capital. In this chapter, Marx elaborates on supply and demand and its relation to the cost of production. I realize I repeat myself a little bit in these videos, but I do so only to help with the understanding of the concepts. As for the simplicity of these videos, well, Marx starts off pretty simple. The complexity will increase as we continue in the series, but hopefully I'll still be able to explain it all nicely. So, let's get started. During the last part, we spoke about how labor power is a commodity, how it relates to the worker and the capitalist, and also on what prices and wages really are. As we said, a wage is simply the term for the price of labor power, which is a commodity itself. Naturally then, its price would be determined by the laws that govern any other commodity. So how is the price of a commodity determined then? Marx says it is threefold. Firstly, by the competition between buyers and sellers, secondly, by supply and demand, and thirdly, by the call to offer. Naturally, one commodity, like chairs for example, is sold by various sellers. Whoever sells these chairs for the same quality or superior quality at the lowest price will naturally drive all the other sellers from this particular field and have for themselves the largest share of the market. Such a seller secures the market to himself in this case. So, as a direct result of this possibility, sellers compete with one another for sales and hence the market. Their aim is to sell as much as possible, and to sell alone, if possible, via the exclusion of all other sellers from this particular market. Now, as previously stated, those who produce a commodity of the same or superior quality for the lowest price will win this game of competition. Each seller hopes and tries to sell whatever commodity cheaper than other sellers. This competition between the sellers of commodities forces the prices of these commodities down. This competition isn't only between the sellers, though. There exists also competition between those who purchase commodities, with competition between the buyers. This competition for a particular commodity or commodities causes the prices of these commodities to rise as they are heavily desired. Now, we have established that competition exists between sellers and competition exists between buyers. The final competition is between the buyers and the sellers. One wants to buy a commodity as cheaply as possible, while the other wants to sell the commodity for as much money as possible. The determining factor for who wins between the camp of buyers and the camp of sellers is the relation between the two, meaning whether the competition between the sellers is stronger or between the buyers is stronger. If it is the former, then the price of the commodity goes down. If it is the latter, then the price of the commodity goes up. Again, this is best illustrated by using the excellent example Marx himself gave in the work. The example uses bales of cotton. A bale is basically a wrapped up bundle of something. So in this example, a bale of cotton is a wrapped up bundle of cotton. Let's assume that there are 100 bales of cotton in the market, but there are 1,000 buyers for these bales of cotton. The demand in this case is 10 times higher than the supply. Naturally, the competition between these buyers is very strong, with each buyer wanting to get a hold of one or more bales of cotton each. As a result of this competition, with each buyer wanting the cotton for themselves, some buyers will offer a higher price, relatively, for the bales of cotton. In this instance, the sellers who normally compete with one another will beware of pulling one another's hair in order to force down the price of cotton at the very moment in which their opponents, the buyers, race with one another to screw it up high, as Marx says. Simply, the competition between the sellers in this case drops, as they all would like to sell for as expensive as possible, and hence would avoid stepping on each other's toes through unnecessary competition in this case. As the competition between sellers decreases, the competition between buyers increases. The result of all this? Simply a rise in the price of the commodities. The instance of a high demand and small supply is relatively infrequent in modern capitalism, however. Let's talk about the inverse case, where there's a large, usually excess, supply in comparison to the demand. In this case, there's a lack of buyers, and the competition between the sellers is heightened, which causes the prices to fall, resulting in cheaper commodities. Marx continues this example by posing a few questions. What exactly is a rise or fall in prices? If the price is determined by the relation of supply and demand, then how is the relation of supply and demand itself determined? Marx yet again illustrates this using an example. He tells us to turn to the first worthy citizen we meet. So let's do so. Let's turn to this worthy citizen. If we were to pose the above questions to him, he would tell us a little story along these lines. If producing the commodities he wants to sell has cost him, let's say, $100, and through selling these commodities he makes $110, then he has made a moderate profit. If he makes $120, $130, or even $200, then he has a higher amount of profit. If we analyze what this worthy citizen is telling us, is that his standard of profit is the cost of production of the commodities he sells. Hence, we can conclude, as Marx says, if in exchange for these goods he receives a quantity of other goods whose production has cost less, he has lost. If he receives in exchange for his goods a quantity of other goods whose production has cost more, he has gained. And he reckons the falling or rising of the profit according to the degree at which the exchange value of his goods stands, whether above or below his zero, the cost of production. So if this worthy citizen receives goods that cost more to produce than his goods, he gains. If he receives goods that cost less to produce than his goods, he loses. Hence, our worthy citizen measures the fall or rise in his profits based on the price of his goods in relation to the cost of production of these goods. We understand now that the change in relations between supply and demand can either cause a rise or a fall in prices. Here is where some confusion lies, though, so I'll try to explain this as clear as I can. The price of a commodity expresses, in the form of money, the ratio, or proportion, in which one commodity will be exchanged for another commodity. To put this into an example, one table may cost $10, while a chair costs $5, so one table could be exchanged for 2 chairs. Keeping within this framework, if the price of a commodity rises due to, for example, a fall in supply or a rise in demand, if the price of a commodity rises, then the price of some other commodity must fall in proportion to the rise of the price of the first commodity. For example, if the price of silk rises from $100 to $200, then the price of silver would fall in relation to the silk. Also, the prices of all other commodities, which remained stationary up until the change in the price of silk, the price of all other commodities would fall as well in relation to the price of silk. Basically, and to put this in as simple terms as I can, a larger quantity of stuff, be it silver or any other commodity, a larger quantity of them is now required in order to receive the same amount of silk in an exchange. A large quantity of silver, or any other commodity for that matter, must be given in exchange in order to obtain the same amount of silk now. Here's where this all ties together though. Marx asks us, what will be the consequence of a rise in the price of a particular commodity? The answer is simple. Capital will move into this profitable branch of industry, like silk, as per our previous example, and this movement, this immigration of capital into this prosperous industry, will keep happening until it yields no more than the customary profits, or, rather, until the price of its products, of its commodities, owing to overproduction, sinks below the cost of production, their cost of production. The inverse is also true. If the price of a particular commodity falls below its cost of production, then capital will move away from the production of this commodity, as its profitability has gone down. This reduction in profitability, as Marx said, is usually due to the price of a commodity falling below its cost of production. No one will produce a commodity that costs more to make than what the manufacturer charges. For example, no one will produce a chair that costs $5 to make, but sells for only $2. Due to this flight of capital away from this unprofitable industry, the production of such a commodity, meaning its supply, will decrease, and will continue to decrease until it matches the demand for it. Due to this capital moving away, the price of this commodity will steadily rise again to the level of its cost of production, or until the supply has fallen below the demand. With the demand for this particular commodity now being higher than its supply, its price rises above the cost of production and hence becomes profitable again, causing capital to migrate back into this industry since it has again become profitable. Marx notes an exception to this rule, however, that being obsolete or dying branches of industry that are doomed to disappear. In this case, capital will migrate away and not come back. Hence, we see that capital moves out of one industry and into another. A commodity that commands a high price will see a lot of migration into its branch of industry, while a commodity that commands a low price will see a lot of migration away from its branch of industry. Marx wraps this up by saying, "We have just seen how the fluctuation of supply and demand always bring the price of a commodity back to its cost of production. The actual price of a commodity indeed stands always above or below the cost of production, but the rise and fall reciprocally balance each other out so that within a certain period of time, the commodities will be exchanged for one another in accordance with their cost of production. Their price is thus determined by their cost of production." After this clear explanation Marx gives, he goes on to talk about how the determining of the price of a commodity by the cost of production shouldn't be understood in the same way as bourgeois economists understand it. They say that the average price of a commodity equals the cost of production. They regard the movement in which the rise in price is compensated for by a fall in price, and the fall by a rise as an accident. Marx says, however, that we might just as well consider the fluctuation as the law, and the determination of the price by cost of production as an accident, which is indeed done by other economists. Marx continues by saying, "It is precisely these fluctuations that force the price to conform to the cost of production. In the total course of this industrial anarchy, in this circular movement, competition balances, as it were, the one extravagance by the other. So in total, we see that the price of a commodity is determined by its cost of production, but in such a manner that the periods in which the price of said commodities rises above the cost of production are balanced by periods in which it sinks below the cost of production, and vice versa." Marx goes on to point out that this stands not for one product of an industry, but for the branch of industry as a whole. He also mentions that it doesn't stand for one particular manufacturer, but for all manufacturers within an industry. Since we have established that the cost of production determines the price of a commodity, we can ask ourselves, what determines the cost of production then? Well, the cost of production consists firstly of raw materials, machinery, the wear and tear of tools, etc., of, for example, industrial products, whose production costs a certain number of workdays, or other time duration, which themselves represents a certain amount of labor time. This is the first thing. And secondly, by the direct labor that went into producing the commodity, which is also measured by its duration. This is all incredibly important because the determination of price by cost of production is synonymous to the determination of price by the labor time necessary to the production of a commodity. The determination of price by cost of production is tantamount to the determination of price by the labor time requisite to the production of a commodity, for the cost of production consists first of raw materials and wear and tear of tools, etc., of, for example, industrial products whose production has cost a certain number of workdays, which therefore represents a certain amount of labor time, and secondly, of direct labor, which is also measured by its duration. In the next chapter, Marx discusses how exactly wages are determined. I hope you'll tune into that video when I finally put it up, and that's all for this one. Thanks for watching.
You know how buying new tech is.
With Whimsy's dental treats, you get the best of both. The pure pleasure of a treat and the benefit of...
Hello, this is part 3 of my series on Marx's work Wage, Labor, and Capital. In this pretty short chapter, Marx elaborates on what exactly determines wages. So, let's get started. As we mentioned in previous videos, the same laws that regulate the price of commodities in general will regulate wages, a wage being the price of labor power, as we have mentioned in other videos. Hence, wages are generally regulated according to the relation between supply and demand, and according to the competition between the buyers of labor power, the capitalists, and the sellers of labor power, the workers. Adding on to this what we learned in earlier chapters, we see that in modern capitalism, the supply of workers is high, hence large amounts of unemployment virtually everywhere. In reality, this unemployment is manufactured. It isn't real. This unemployment is done by design because it benefits the capitalists. If workers compete with one another for employment, the capitalists can get away with forcing workers to work long hours in horrible conditions for horrendous pay, and no one will bat an eye. Why? Because the workers need to live. The fear of unemployment always looms overhead, forcing the workers to remain docile and not ask for humane working conditions or livable wages. The facade that classical economists peddle, in which a worker can simply go somewhere else if he is unhappy, is exactly that, just a facade. Nevertheless, let's get back to Marx. As we said, wages will rise and fall according to the laws already mentioned. Wages will fluctuate just as the price of any other commodity will fluctuate, either above or below its cost of production. Within the limits of these fluctuations, however, the price of the commodity of the workers, labor power, will be determined by its cost of production. It will be determined by the labor time necessary for the production of labor power. Simply, the wage is determined by the cost of production of labor power. To put it the way Marx did, the price of labor power, that being the wage, will be determined by the cost of production by the labor time necessary for production of this commodity, labor power. Marx then asks us, what then is the cost of production of labor power? Marx answers this question with the following. The cost of production of labor power is the cost required for the maintenance of the laborer as a laborer, and for his education and training as a laborer. Hence, the less time it takes to train a worker for some kind of work, the less is the cost of production of that worker, and hence the less is the price of his labor power. In other words, the less skilled a worker is, the smaller his wage will be, within the realms of supply and demand, of course. In certain industries where a worker requires a lot of education or expertise, then his wage shall be higher, as his cost of production is higher. In certain industries where just the existence of the worker is necessary, meaning there is no need for any education or technical skill, then his cost of production, his wage, is practically limited only to keeping him alive and in working condition. The price of his work will therefore be determined by the price of the necessary means of subsistence. Marx notes another consideration that comes into account, however. Using another one of his excellent examples, he goes on to tell us that a manufacturer takes into account the wear and tear of the instruments of labor. This manufacturer certainly calculates the cost of this wear and tear and adds it to the cost of the products in such a way that he will be able to fix or refurbish the instruments of production when they break down, eventually. Basically, if a machine has cost the manufacturer, let's say $1,000, and this machine is used in 10 years, then he adds $100 annually to the price of his commodities so that in 10 years he has another $1,000 with which he can replace the worn-out machine with a new one. After explaining this, Marx goes on to say, in the same manner, the cost of production of simple labor power must include the cost of propagation, by means of which the race of workers is enabled to multiply itself, and to replace worn-out workers with new ones. The wear and tear of the worker, therefore, is calculated in the same manner as the wear and tear of the machine. Therefore, the cost of production of simple labor power, as Marx put it, meaning the wage of unskilled workers, is the cost of their existence and propagation. These wages are termed as the minimum of wages by Marx. This minimum wage, just like the determining of the price of a commodity by its cost of production, doesn't hold for only one person, but for the race of workers Marx spoke of earlier. The wages thus determined are called the minimum of wages. This minimum wage, like the determination of the price of commodities in general by cost of production, does not hold good for the single individual, but only for the race. Individual workers, indeed millions of workers, do not receive enough to be able to exist and to propagate themselves, but the wages of the whole working class adjust themselves, within the limits of their fluctuations, to this minimum. This concludes this chapter. In the next chapter, Marx discusses the nature and growth of capital. That's when we get into the real meat of this work. I hope you'll join me for that when I decide to put it up, and that's all. Thanks for watching.
Really doesn't require much.
Hey, take two. Try to be shorter and sweeter. Hello, I am Katana the Lightning Cat, self-proclaimed favorite idiot of you.
Hello! In this video, I'll be discussing the next chapter in Marx's Wage, Labor, and Capital. In this section, Marx talks about what capital is, how it is created, how it defines capitalist society, and why it, and consequently capitalism, needs the working class in order to exist and propagate. First of all, what is capital? The first answer Marx gives to this question is the answer of the economists. Capital is simply the raw materials, the instruments of labor, and the means of subsistence which are used to produce new raw materials, new instruments of labor, and new means of subsistence. The interesting bit of all this, though, is that all the things we just mentioned, raw materials, etc., are created by labor. They are all products of labor. Marx calls them accumulated labor. This accumulated labor, capital, is itself used to produce more capital. To help us wrap our heads around capital, Marx uses an example of old American slavery. He asks us, what is an African slave? Some would say that he's a man of the black race. But this explanation isn't good enough. A man of the black race is just a man of the black race. Only under certain special conditions does he, or anyone else for that matter, become a slave. In the same vein, a machine that spins cotton is simply a machine that spins cotton. Only under certain special conditions does it become capital. Away from these special conditions, it ceases to be capital. Marx says, torn away from these conditions, it is as little capital as gold is itself money, or sugar is the price of sugar. Marx goes on to talk about how humans interconnect during production. Now, this may seem random, but bear with me. Marx ties this all together very nicely. Human beings work upon nature through, for example, turning of raw materials into other things useful to us in some way, and human beings also work upon one another. What does this mean, exactly? Well, our work depends on each other. As Marx says, human beings produce only by working together in a specified manner and reciprocally exchanging their activities. In order to produce, they enter into definite connections and relations to one another, and only within these social connections and relations does their influence upon nature operate, does production take place. These social relations between these human beings, these producers, and the conditions under which they exchange their activities, their share in the total act of production, changes with the changing means of production. Now, to help us understand this, Marx gives a military example that beautifully illustrates this concept. With the discovery of a new instrument of warfare, for example the firearm, the whole internal organization of the army was necessarily altered. The relations within which individuals compose an army and can work as an army were transformed, and the relation of different armies to another was likewise changed. In the same way, the social relations between human beings and the conditions under which they exchange their activities changes with changing means of production. Why is this important? Well, these relations of production, and the way human beings relate to each other in regard to production, form certain social relations at a definite stage of historical development. They form a society with peculiar, distinctive characteristics. Each stage of society, of human society, from slave society through feudalism and finally to our current capitalist society, each stage of society are totalities, collections of these social relations, which mark a certain stage in the development of the history of mankind. Now, capital itself is one of these social relations. It's a capitalist relation of production, a relation of production of capitalist society. We have already established that raw materials, means of production, and means of subsistence, etc. are capital. However, capital does not only consist of material products, it also consists of exchange values. All the products of which capital consists of are commodities, as we have established earlier. As Marx puts it, capital, consequently, is not only a sum of material products, it is a sum of commodities, of exchange values, of social magnitudes. Capital will stay the same whether we put cotton in the place of wool, or copper in the place of iron, or steamships in the place of railroads. Capital will remain the same as long as the cotton, the copper, the steamships, etc. have the same exchange value, the same price as the wool or the iron or the railroads. Marx says, the bodily form of capital may transform itself continually, while capital does not suffer the least alteration. Now we have established that all capital is a sum of commodities, a sum of exchange values. However, not every sum of commodities, of exchange values, is capital itself. The following point Marx makes is something we've already touched on in previous videos, so I'll just directly quote from the book. Every sum of exchange values is an exchange value. Each particular exchange value is a sum of exchange values. For example, a house worth £1,000 is an exchange value of £1,000. A piece of paper worth 1 penny is a sum of exchange values of 1/100th of a penny. Products which are exchangeable for others are commodities. The definite proportion in which they are exchangeable forms their exchange value, or, expressed in money, their price. The quantity of these products can have no effect on their character as commodities, as representing an exchange value, as having a certain price. Whether a tree be large or small, it remains a tree. Whether we exchange iron in pennyweights or in hundredweights for other products, does this alter its character, its being a commodity or exchange value? According to the quantity, it is a commodity of greater or of lesser value, of higher or of lower price. I think this is all self-explanatory. If you don't understand anything, just ask me a question in the comments. Now, Marx asks us, how does a sum of commodities, a sum of exchange values, become capital? Marx himself beautifully answers this by saying, thereby that, meaning capital, as an independent social power, as the power of a part of society, it preserves itself and multiplies by exchange with direct living labor. The existence of a class which has nothing but the ability to work is a necessary presupposition of capital. It is only the dominion of past accumulated, materialized labor over immediate living labor that stamps the accumulated labor with the character of capital. Basically, what Marx here is saying is accumulated labor becomes only capital once it feeds off of living labor. Capital isn't accumulated labor that serves living labor as a way for a new production. In fact, it's the very opposite. Living labor serves accumulated labor as a means of preserving and multiplying its exchange value. In the next chapter, Marx goes on to talk about the relation of wage labor to capital. From now on, we'll be getting into the real meat of this essay. I hope you'll join me for that, and that's it for this one. Thank you for watching.
Man, this is gonna...
You said close.
Let's see. Let's go back to figuring out which I guess he didn't finish that.
Hi there. I've timestamped this so that you can skip through to whatever question you want to hear rather than just sit through the many minutes I ramble on for. So, let's get started, shall we? So, the first question is, I'd be interested in learning more about Cambodia, the divide between China and Vietnam, and such things. Maybe it's more of a topic for a video, but feel free to answer in your Q&A. Maybe this will have to wait for a video because I don't feel confident enough speaking about it because I haven't done enough research. If you are interested though, A nice place to start would be a biography of Ho Chi Minh, because it goes over, well, the area of Indochina, as well as him being intimately involved with what was going on there. So that's what I would recommend. Thoughts on GMOs? They're good. I never understood the hate. I've never seen any research that would point to them being negative. Preferred genre of music? I don't really have a preferred genre of music. I'm not a big music person. I just listen to whatever's on. Favorite non-Marxist / leftist YouTube channels? I enjoy Funhouse. I mean, I think that's really about it. Do you think Islam and communism are compatible? If so, how and why? This will definitely be a topic for another video, because I've been promising to make one for quite a while. It will happen, don't worry. Specifically Islam and socialism, but there's a lot of overlap, specifically in economic theory. Yeah, I'll save this particular thing for a future video, which will be coming, don't worry. I know I've been promising for a while, it will come. What were the main reasons for the fall of the USSR and the Eastern Bloc in your view? Will there be a legal non-socialist opposition and parties in your concept of a socialist state, and when not, why? The USSR didn't fall or collapse. It was illegally dissolved against the democratic will of the Soviet people and people of the Eastern Bloc. But contributing factors were revisionism, which led to things like market reforms and whatnot, and that's really at the heart of it.
Here we go. This will be better. 2 hours. 2 hours. We got time.
All right, Hakeem, let's get right down to it. I've got a question from Justin right here. Ooh, and he's getting into the thick of it with my boy Gnome. So Justin, or actually is Jusin, Jusin. Jusin asks, one argument made by Chomsky when he compares Indian and Chinese famines is that India had a more open media environment, which forced the government to intervene productively when journalists would expose malpractices resulting in starvation or other humanitarian crises. The Soviet Union, like China, did not have this. They chose not to be public about the events in Ukraine because this would have been the basis of a crisis of domestic and international legitimacy. What do you make of this argument from Chomsky, and what may it tell us about how we view the scale of these famines that occurred in both communist states? And I just want to commend Jusin. Amazing question.
That's a very interesting question.
And I can reread it if you want to chew on it a little bit more there.
No, that's fine. Don't worry. I think we can split that into two bits. The first part is about journalistic freedom, and then the second part is about the publicity of the famines. On the first part, I agree wholeheartedly. There is, and historically has been, an issue with, let's say, levels of journalistic observation, we could say, of these events. And that occurred both in China and the USSR, but with the necessary caveats I'll answer in the second half of this.
Very true.
But you're very much correct. This is something that needs to be rectified in the future. We shouldn't have... there is two sides to it, right? On one hand, we understand that the press, like everything else in a modern nation state, can be used by different entities for different purposes. So, for example, if there is a possibility for a particular group to use it to spread, let's say, anti-Semitic or racist or sexist remarks and attempt to popularize them in society, these are things that can be combated. But on the other hand, free access of information, especially when it is of vital importance to people's lives and access to the things that they need, this is something of utmost importance and should be allowed to an extent. So this is very much so an error of former socialism that needs to be corrected in future attempts. As for the second part of the question on the publicity aspect, I would disagree in that the claim there, for example, when we're taking the 1931-1932 famine, is that there was no publicity. The thing is that the central government didn't even know what was happening until maybe the mid 1931. So it's been already going on for a little bit. This happened because of numerous issues, particularly mid-level official corruption, and also the fact of that there was very primitive. We got to remember that most of these countries, for example, the USSR and China, came from incredibly poor agrarian semi-feudal states.
and as a result, they did not have the infrastructure for communication that we kind of take for granted today. Most of the time, it was either through telegrams or through people personally delivering letters. For example, in China, and with that, I think we can see that there's more nuance there. That it's very difficult to have this open amount of information be spread, especially when the government, who needs to know the most about the situation, could barely even get a hold of the information necessary, what's exactly going on. You even see it in telegrams that have been, what's the English word for this? Declassified, I believe? Yeah, declassified, from the Soviet archives, where you see the central government, some of the telegrams being signed directly by Stalin, saying, what is going on? We have no idea what's going on. Why don't you guys, where is this information? Why is it 2 weeks late? Blah, blah. There's several of these that you see. So it shows that the chaos of the thing. When it comes to the Chinese experience, it's similar, but it's also way more nuanced than that.
Well, can I
just
like
say,
wait in there real quick?
Freedom, or lack
I'm sure that we could find. Yeah, I'm sure that we
Yeah,
can find
go ahead.
innumerous telegrams from Donald Trump right now at the pinnacle of human telecommunications, where he's like, "What's going on? What the fuck is happening?" and so forth. The first part of your argument is really strong, where you say that that it took a while to understand the capacity of the depth and scope of what's going on, but they did have modern telegraphic communications at that point, or relatively modern. I don't. Well, let me not wade in too deep, but I do want to move the AMA along. I think that's a good answer.
Sure.
I'd like to get to Chimichanga's answer right here. Chimichanga's asks, why do you think the value of items is objective and not subjective when there are multiple examples to prove you otherwise? For example, the value of a coat changes depending on what season we're in. And if you're going to say price and value are different, then explain cryptocurrencies. Is there a difference between their price and their value when they directly correlate based on scarcity?
Yeah, I really like this question because the person answers it, and then when they assume that I'm going to state the answer, the correct answer to that, then they're like, oh, well, if you're going to say this, then what is about this? But the second part is also answered by the first part. So first thing is, when it comes to objectivity of value, you need to understand that, first of all, there's a misunderstanding that goes on between price and value, between the basic... this is the best way of actually internalizing the Marxist criticism of capitalism. Always remember that when we have discussions, for example, between value and price, remember that the assumption there is that supply and demand is equalized. That's why. And we see that when we have such... in the real world, these situations rarely occur, but we can empirically create them when testing, right? And when we do that, we see that price does generally fluctuate to levels as high as 98% around the value, the labor input of said commodity, which is very interesting. But the thing about, for example, like a coat is more or less valuable depending. It doesn't matter what you personally perceive it as, right? If supply and demand were equalized, then it would be the value wouldn't change. What you're seeing is a difference in the supply and the demand happening. There's a higher supply in winter and a lower supply. Higher demand in winter and a lower demand in summer. And as a result, because of the higher demand in winter, people want it more, hence the price goes up. If there's a lower demand in summer, then less people want it, and as a result, the price goes down. As for cryptocurrency, this is very interesting, especially when we get into the discussion of fiat currencies and whatnot. There's some interesting stuff that's been written on this. But generally, from the Marxist position, you got to realize that when it comes to cryptocurrencies, that's nothing more than your electricity bill being monetized, essentially. There is a value, there is a social and labor time for recreating, for example, a Bitcoin. Right now, that can change depending on the amount of effort that needs to go into creating it. People say, "Oh, it's just a click of a button," but when you do mining nowadays, you have to take into account, for example, all the labor that goes into everything that you need to get that to get the mining done, which includes the electricity, includes the computer components, includes the networks, all the engineers that put the system together, and what have you. And the reason that there is heightened, like let's say the prices, the seeming price is very high, is because there's speculation on these, right? People want to hoard coins so that the price goes up, so then they sell it, right? This is still a supply and demand argument. You're not getting to the core, which is value. If you want to understand value, then Marx has an excellent essay called Value, Price, and Profit. It's very short, it's very concise, and I highly recommend you take a look at it. It'll clear up all these and more. There's also another one called Wage, Labor, and Capital. These two essays, if you were to take a look at them, you're going to get, I'd say, the gist of the Marxist criticism of capitalism without having to touch capital, which I still recommend you do. It's not nearly as hard as people make it out.
All right, great. Let's take a deep breath. you have at least 2 hours here. Wally P. OK, TJ Silius 24/7 asks, why are you a commie? And if you wouldn't mind detailing what particular flavor of communism is most appealing to you and why.
Sure, I'd love to. By the way, apologies if I speak quickly. That's just my natural rate of speech. I realize I need to slow it down sometimes.
Yeah, just a tiny bit. We're all friends.
Yeah, my apologies. Of course, yeah, no, I'm having a great time. I love doing these AMAs because people come with very, they're very open with their questions. They don't hide any punches. Is that the English saying? You know what I'm trying to say.
They're right in your face, yeah.
But yeah, so why am I a communist and what is the flavor of Marxist that I am, that I consider to, or socialist that I consider to be ideal? The reason I am a Marxist personally is because, well, I'm Iraqi, and my personal experience has been growing up in this country is that of continued imperial aggression against my country. That, and also I lived in or I grew up in an environment that was of an anti-colonial flavor, let's say. And that kind of parallels a lot of third world people and their politics. But for the longest time, I was just that. I was just a lukewarm, like anti-colonial, vaguely anti-imperialist. I know I didn't like the way that the big, quote-unquote, big countries bullied the small countries, and I had no fundamental understanding or framework around that. A couple of years passed, I come across the writings of Marx while I'm doing my own political research, and I decide to read Marx first, and I read Lenin afterwards, and reading Lenin's Imperialism, the high stage of capitalism, really gave me that fundamental framework of what I was feeling. Why is finance capital, monopolies, this conquering of new markets, why is it that sometimes it's insidious like IMF loans? Why is it sometimes outright with military action? This was like the first step to seeing the light, you could say, for me. Then afterwards, I delved deep into the criticism of capitalism because I had my own vague criticisms of capitalism that almost everybody does, right, with their political system and whatnot. I had those same criticisms that were kind of untargeted, but I took a look into that. I read the criticisms of capitalism that existed. I looked into the histories of the different socialist countries. I looked into the history of liberalism, for example, and as an ideological trend. And that kind of helped me understand why the world.
I think I'm gonna head off for tonight. I will probably be on tomorrow morning, and we'll go on for a while. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you